My parents leaned across their mahogany dining room table, their voices perfectly calibrated to inflict maximum guilt, and told me that I owed my sister her happiness. The price tag for this so-called happiness was a $62,000 wedding invoice shoved directly under my nose. When I looked my own mother in the eye and refused to pay it, she did not just yell. She and my father came back at me with 4 aggressive corporate lawyers and demanded the deed to my only property. They thought they had cornered a weak, obedient daughter. What they did not know was that the signature they were trying so desperately to extort from me was already a meticulously crafted trap designed by an accountant who knew exactly how to balance the scales of justice. My name is Chloe. I am 31 years old, and I work as a certified public accountant at a mid-sized accounting firm in downtown Chicago. I spend my days tracking missing funds, identifying financial fraud, and ensuring the numbers always align. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled my family's vicious extortion plot and sent their high-priced legal team running for the hills, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel if you genuinely connect with stories about reclaiming your worth. Please drop a comment right now and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one, and it means the world to me to connect with you. Now let me take you back to the evening my family decided my future was simply a bank account for them to drain. For as long as I can remember, love in my family was highly conditional and strictly transactional, though I was the only one paying the bill. My parents, Thomas and Patricia, raised me to be the safety net, the dependable workhorse, the quiet one who asked for nothing and gave everything. My younger sister, Brittany, was the undeniable golden child. Brittany is 28 now, but she has always been treated like fragile, precious glass. If Brittany wanted to take expensive art classes, my parents found the money. If Brittany needed a new car because she wrecked her old one, the money miraculously appeared. I, on the other hand, was told that independence builds character. I paid my own way through college by working triple shifts at a diner. I studied until my eyes blurred, earned my CPA license, and built a solid, respectable career. Because I was responsible, my parents simply assumed my income was a communal family asset. I lived incredibly frugally. I drove a 10-year-old sedan with a rattling exhaust. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, skipping vacations and dinners out. I did all of this to keep the peace and to keep my family afloat. 3 years ago, my father called me in a panic. His construction business had hit a rough patch, and they were going to lose their suburban house if they did not pay off a $40,000 home equity line of credit. They begged me for help. I emptied my hard-earned savings and paid the bank directly. I wiped out their debt. I did not ask for a parade, but a simple thank you would have been nice. Instead, my mother told me that family helps family. Shortly after that, I quietly took over Brittany's student loan payments because she claimed her entry-level marketing job did not pay enough for her to survive. I was draining my own life to sustain theirs, believing that my sacrifice would eventually earn their love. The inciting incident of my entire awakening happened on a chilly Tuesday evening. My parents had invited me to a special family dinner at their pristine suburban home. They said they had wonderful news to share. I arrived straight from work, still wearing my gray office suit, carrying a bottle of wine I had spent too much money on. When I walked into the dining room, the atmosphere felt strangely formal, almost staged. My mother, Patricia, was wearing her Sunday best. My father, Thomas, stood by the bar cart swirling a glass of bourbon. Sitting at the table was Brittany, practically glowing, and next to her was Chad, her newly minted fiancé. Chad came from a family of wealthy local real estate developers. He wore a designer watch, smiled with too many teeth, and always looked at me like I was the hired help who had accidentally wandered into the main house. There was no warm greeting when I sat down. No one asked how my day at the firm was. No one asked if I was tired. Patricia simply smiled a tight, rehearsed smile and slid a thick leather-bound folder across the polished wood table until it stopped right in front of my hands. "Open it, Chloe," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I opened the folder. Inside was a detailed, itemized contract from the Oak Creek Country Club, the most exclusive and expensive venue in our county. I scanned the lines. Custom floral arrangements, a 5-course plated dinner for 200 guests, premium open bar, a live band. My eyes dropped to the final total at the bottom of the page. $62,000. I blinked, confused. I looked up at my mother, then at my father, and finally at Brittany, who was admiring her diamond engagement ring. "This is a very high estimate," I said carefully, maintaining my professional tone. "Are you asking me to review the budget for you? I can probably help you negotiate these catering costs down." Chad let out a short, condescending laugh. "We do not negotiate, Chloe. It is about making the right impression for my parents' friends." My mother leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. "We do not need you to review the budget, Chloe. We need you to pay it." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I stared at Patricia, waiting for the punchline, waiting for someone to laugh. No one laughed. Thomas took a slow sip of his bourbon, his eyes locked on me with an intense, intimidating pressure. "Pay it!" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mom, I do not have $62,000 lying around to pay for a country club wedding. Even if I did, that is an absurd amount of money to demand from me." Patricia's expression hardened. The artificial sweetness vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating look she always used when she wanted to force my compliance. "Do not be selfish, Chloe. You make excellent money at your firm. You do not have a husband, you do not have children, and you live in that tiny apartment. What else are you spending your money on? Chad's family expects a certain standard. We cannot look like peasants in front of his parents. You owe your sister her happiness. You owe your sister happiness." The sheer audacity of that statement struck me like a physical blow. For a moment, the room spun. I looked at Brittany. She did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She just stared at me expectantly, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and fund her luxury lifestyle just as I had always done. I looked at Chad, who was smirking, clearly enjoying the dynamic of watching the lesser sister being shaken down for cash. Then I looked at my parents, the people who had happily drained my bank accounts for years, the people who took my sacrifices for granted. A strange, powerful heat began to rise in my chest. It was not sorrow. It was not the familiar heavy guilt they usually manage to instill in me. It was pure, unadulterated rage. I closed the leather folder and pushed it back across the table toward my mother. "No," I said. The single syllable dropped like a bomb in the quiet dining room. Patricia blinked, clearly taken aback. "Excuse me." I said no. I repeated, my voice growing stronger, louder. "I am not paying $62,000 for a wedding. I do not owe Brittany her happiness, and I certainly do not owe you another dime." Thomas slammed his glass down on the bar cart. The sharp crack of crystal against wood made Brittany jump. "You will watch your tone in this house, young lady." My father barked, his face turning an angry shade of red. "Your sister is marrying into a prominent family. This is an investment in her future. You are going to help your family just like you are supposed to. Help this family." I stood up from the table. My chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "I have done nothing but help this family. Let us talk about investments, Dad. 3 years ago, you called me crying because the bank was going to foreclose on this exact house. I paid off your $40,000 home equity line of credit. I wiped out your debt so you would not be living on the street. Have you paid me back a single dollar? No. And Brittany," I turned to my sister, whose eyes were now wide with shock. "You complain that you cannot afford your lifestyle, so I have been paying your student loans every month for 2 years. Chad shifted uncomfortably in his seat, looking at Brittany with sudden suspicion. "Wait," he said. "You told me your parents paid off your student loans." Brittany went pale, stammering Chad. "Honey, it is complicated." "It is not complicated at all," I interrupted, looking directly at Chad's arrogant face. "They are broke, and she is broke. I am the only one funding this charade." I turned back to my mother, my hands trembling not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally speaking the truth. "I have sacrificed my own financial security to keep you all afloat. I have bought my peace in this family for years. But the bank is closed. I am not paying for this wedding." Patricia stood up, her face twisted with a venom I had never seen directed at me so openly. "You ungrateful, miserable girl," she hissed. "We raised you. We gave you everything. You gave me obligations," I fired back. "You gave me your debts." Thomas marched across the room, closing the distance between us until he was standing mere inches from my face. He tried to use his physical size to intimidate me, looming over me with his fists clenched at his sides. The mask of the loving father was completely gone. In its place was a desperate, dangerous man. "If you want to play hardball." "Chloe, we will play hardball," Thomas sneered, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. "If you are going to be a greedy, selfish brat and refuse to pay for your sister's wedding, then you can surrender the lake house." The air vanished from my lungs. The lake house. When my beloved grandmother passed away 5 years ago, she shocked everyone by leaving her beautiful waterfront cabin entirely to me. She knew how my parents operated. She knew they would squander it. She left it in my name, a pristine property fully paid off worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was my sanctuary, the only place I felt truly safe. "You are not touching my grandmother's house," I said, my voice dangerously low. "It is family property," Thomas shouted, slamming his fist onto the dining table so hard the silverware rattled. "Mom never should have left it to you. You do not even use it. You are going to sign the deed over to us by the end of this month. We will sell it, pay for the wedding, and keep the rest for our retirement. If you do not sign it over, I swear to God, Chloe, I will make your life a living hell." Patricia stepped up beside him, nodding in absolute agreement. "You owe us, Chloe. Sign the deed or you will regret it." I looked at the four of them. My father vibrating with rage. My mother cold and entitled. My sister cowering but eager for her payout. And Chad watching the ugly reality of his future in-laws unfold. They were not a family asking for a favor. They were a cartel demanding a shakedown. I picked up my purse. I did not yell. I did not cry. I looked my father dead in the eye and said, "You will never get that house." I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room. I heard Thomas shouting my name, demanding I come back, but I did not stop. I walked out the front door, got into my 10-year-old car and locked the doors. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. As I drove away from the suburban nightmare I had funded for far too long, my phone started buzzing relentlessly with angry text messages from my mother. I thought walking out would be the end of the fight. I thought setting a boundary would simply result in the silent treatment, maybe a few months of awkward holidays. I was incredibly naive. Walking out of that dining room did not end the conflict. It ignited a war. By refusing to pay the $62,000, I had unknowingly triggered a catastrophic chain of events. My parents were not just angry, they were desperate. And desperate people do not just yell. They scheme. They destroy. I drove into the night completely unaware that within 48 hours, my parents would launch a devastating legal and psychological attack that would threaten to destroy my career, steal my property, and put me behind bars. The nightmare was just beginning. The cold morning air hit my face the moment I stepped out of my apartment building carrying my briefcase and a travel mug of coffee. My mind was already running through the day ahead, organizing client files and tax audits, trying desperately to push the ugly memory of last night's dining room confrontation to the back of my mind. I walked down the concrete path toward my designated parking spot, pulling my keys from my coat pocket. I pressed the unlock button. Nothing happened. I looked up, expecting to see the familiar silver hood of my 10-year-old sedan. Instead, I saw empty asphalt. For a split second, my brain simply refused to process the image. I blinked, looking at the spot to the left, then the spot to the right. My car was gone. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. I dropped my coffee mug, the dark liquid splashing across the pavement, and ran to the empty space as if standing closer would magically make the vehicle reappear. I scanned the street, my breathing shallow and fast. Car thefts happened in the city, but my complex was quiet, well lit, and my car was hardly a luxury target. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone and dialed the local police precinct. I stood there on the freezing sidewalk, for 10 agonizing minutes, shifting my weight from foot to foot while the dispatcher took my information, ran the plates, and checked the city database. I was fully prepared to file a stolen vehicle report. I was not prepared for the dispatcher's tired, indifferent response. "Ma'am, your vehicle was not stolen," the dispatcher said. "It was towed at 6 o'clock this morning by a private recovery firm." The order was legally authorized by the registered CO owner of the vehicle, a man named Thomas. The air rushed out of my lungs. My father. 7 years ago, when I was fresh out of college with a thin credit history, my father had co-signed the auto loan so I could get a better interest rate. I had made every single payment myself. I had paid off the entire note 3 years early. But because I had trusted him, because I had believed we were a family, I had never forced him to go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles with me to formally remove his name from the title. He was still technically listed as a legal co-owner. He knew this. He had remembered this obscure legal loophole and weaponized it against me while I was sleeping. He had not just towed my car, he had sent a message. He was showing me that he could reach into my life from miles away and strip away my independence with a single phone call. I had to order an expensive rideshare to get to work. Sitting in the back seat of a stranger's car watching the city roll by, I felt a deep, hollow ache in my stomach. The sheer cruelty of the act was staggering. My own father had stranded me, hoping the shock and inconvenience would break my spirit and force me back to the negotiation table to pay for my sister's extravagant country club wedding. By the time I reached my accounting firm, I was functioning entirely on autopilot. I sat at my desk staring at spreadsheets, but the numbers blurred together. My mind was racing, trying to anticipate their next move. If my father was willing to exploit a 7-year-old auto loan title just to punish me, what else would they target? The realization hit me like a physical blow. My grandmother's storage unit. When my grandmother passed away, she did not just leave me the lake house. She left me a climate-controlled storage unit downtown that held her most precious personal belongings. Her antique jewelry, her handwritten journals, family photo albums, and all the original legal documents regarding the lake house property. It was the only tangible history I had left of the woman who actually loved me. I did not wait for my lunch break. I told my managing partner I had a family emergency, grabbed my coat, and ordered another ride across town. The storage facility was a massive modern building with tight security. I walked through the glass sliding doors, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I practically ran down the long fluorescent lit hallway to Unit 412. I arrived at the heavy steel door, took a deep breath, and punched my 6-digit access code into the electronic keypad. A harsh red light flashed. The screen displayed a single word: denied. My fingers slipped as I typed the code a second time slower, making sure I hit every number perfectly. The keypad beeped. The red light flashed again. Denied. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I turned and sprinted back down the hallway to the front office. The facility manager, a woman I had spoken to half a dozen times over the years, was sitting behind the reception desk. When she saw my face, her professional smile faded into an expression of deep discomfort. "My access code is not working," I said, leaning over the counter, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "There must be a system error. Unit 412. The manager looked down at her computer screen, her hands hovering awkwardly over the keyboard. "Chloe, I am so sorry. Your father was here right when we opened at 8 this morning. He presented a notarized document proving he was listed as the primary emergency contact and alternate account manager on the original rental agreement your grandmother signed 10 years ago. He claimed there was a legal family dispute regarding the estate and requested a full security freeze on the unit. I had to comply with company policy and change the locks. You cannot access the unit without his written consent." I stepped back from the counter, the floor seeming to tilt beneath my feet. They had locked me out of my own history. They were holding my grandmother's memories hostage. This was not a random temper tantrum. This was a highly coordinated, multi-pronged siege. Within 12 hours of my refusal to pay $62,000 for Brittany's wedding, they had confiscated my transportation and seized control of my most valuable personal documents. They were moving with a ruthless, calculated speed that terrified me. I walked out of the facility and collapsed onto a concrete bench near the street. The chilly wind bit through my coat, but I barely felt it. My phone chimed in my pocket, a sharp, intrusive sound that made me flinch. I pulled it out. It was a text message from my mother. I stared at the screen, reading the words over and over until they burned themselves into my memory. Pay the $62,000 by the end of the month or sign the quitclaim deed to the lake house. You do not get to be greedy while your sister suffers. The sheer entitlement radiating from that message was breathtaking. You do not get to be greedy. I was the one who had sacrificed my savings to pay off their debts. I was the one paying my sister's student loans so she could afford designer clothes. Yet in my mother's twisted reality, keeping my own inheritance and my own hard-earned money was an act of unforgivable greed. I sat on that cold concrete bench and stared at the text message. And then the CPA in me finally woke up. The terrified daughter took a step back, and the financial auditor stepped forward. I began to run the numbers in my head. I began to analyze the situation not as a family dispute, but as a hostile corporate takeover. They wanted $62,000 for a wedding, but if I did not pay it, they wanted the deed to a lake house that was recently appraised at nearly $400,000. The math was wildly disproportionate. Furthermore, you do not launch a coordinated legal strike to seize a car and lock down a storage unit just because you are angry about a country club catering bill. A normal family would simply downsize the wedding. They would cut the guest list. They would find a cheaper venue. But Thomas and Patricia were not acting like parents trying to throw a party. They were acting like desperate people cornered by loan sharks. The sheer aggression, the lightning-fast execution of legal loopholes, the immediate demand for a massive property asset. None of this made sense for a wedding dispute. $62,000 was a smokescreen. The wedding was a convenient excuse. There was a much darker, much more desperate motive driving my parents' actions. They needed capital, massive capital, and they needed it immediately. They were trying to break me psychologically, isolating me, and stripping away my resources so I would blindly sign over a property worth nearly $500,000 just to make the pain stop. If I fought them openly right now, if I screamed and raged and threatened to sue them for the car and the storage unit, they would only accelerate their attacks. They clearly had legal advice. They had prepared for this. I was walking blindly through a minefield they had mapped out in advance. I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting before I made my next move. I needed to uncover the financial rot they were so desperate to hide. And to do that, I needed time. I looked down at my phone. I wiped the tears from my face and took a long, deep breath, feeling the icy air fill my lungs. I opened the text thread with my mother. I would not give them my anger. I would not give them my defiance. I would give them exactly what they expected to see from the quiet, dependable daughter they had bullied for 31 years. I typed my response with steady fingers. Mom, please. My car is gone, and I cannot get into the storage unit. Please do not do this. I am so scared. Let me just figure out how to get the money together. Please give me a few days to think. I pressed send. It was a lie, of course. I was not going to figure out how to pay them. I was going to figure out how to destroy them. I was going to play the terrified, broken victim they wanted me to be, buying myself the crucial days I needed to dig into the shadows of their lives. They thought they had backed a lamb into a corner. They were about to find out they had locked themselves in a cage with a wolf. Based on the sample script styles above, write the requested Part 2.1 in detailed English. Use rich, varied, and flexible language with natural vocabulary and sentence structures. Avoid repeating the same words, phrases, emotional descriptions, sentence patterns, or narrative rhythms too often. Begin each part in a fresh and distinct way. Do not reuse similar opening lines, introductions, pacing, or setup styles from previous parts. The output must be friendly for AI voice reading and must deliver the right emotions. Output only the story content. Do not include headings. Avoid special punctuation marks. Meet the exact target word count. Remove meaningless ellipses because I use an AI voice generator. Important rule. When I ask you to write a specific part, write only that part. Do not continue into the next part. Do not write beyond the requested section. Outline Part 2.1. The Church Confession, 2,000 words. The Investigation Conflict 3. On Sunday, Chloe drives to her parents' affluent suburban church, knowing they will be showing off to Chad's wealthy parents. She slips into the foyer, unseen. The discovery. Hiding behind a floral display, Chloe eavesdrops on a private conversation between Patricia and Chad's parents. The horrifying truth drops. Patricia claims the lake house is Brittany's dowry and is using it as collateral. Thomas's construction company is secretly bankrupt, and Chad's family has agreed to a massive corporate bailout, but only if the lake house is put up as collateral. The wedding invoice was just a smokescreen to bleed Chloe dry. The real target was always the deed to save Thomas from financial ruin and prison for unpaid corporate debts. The cliffhanger. Just as Chloe turns to leave, her phone buzzes with an anonymous email. The subject line reads, "Urgent legal action pending against you." The rain had just begun to fall, drumming a chaotic and heavy rhythm against the roof of my sedan as I sat paralyzed in the driver's seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached, but my eyes were locked completely on the glowing screen of my phone. The subject line of the email glared up at me through the dim light of the church parking lot, bright and terrifying. Urgent legal action pending against you. I took a ragged breath, trying to steady the frantic beating of my heart, and tapped the screen to open the message. The sender was a woman named Jessica Miller. I had to search my memory for a frantic second before the connection clicked into place. Jessica was a girl I had shared a desk with in advanced placement government class back in high school. We had not spoken in over a decade, but I knew through the suburban grapevine that she now worked as a senior paralegal at a highly aggressive, notoriously expensive downtown law firm. The body of the email was brief, typed in the hurried, informal cadence of someone breaking every rule in their professional code of conduct. Chloe, I am risking my entire career and my livelihood by sending you this over a private server, Jessica wrote. But I cannot sit in this office and watch what they are planning to do to you. Your father came in yesterday afternoon. He bypassed our standard associates and directly retained 4 of our senior litigation partners. They do not take cases to negotiate, Chloe. They take cases to completely obliterate the opposition. I attached the drafts they finalized this morning. You need to hire the best defense attorney you can afford immediately. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. 4 senior litigation partners. My father, a man whose construction business was currently drowning in unpaid debts and federal tax evasion, had somehow managed to scrape together a massive retainer fee to hire a team of legal assassins. He was not just trying to bully me into paying for Brittany's ridiculous country club wedding anymore. He was mobilizing a corporate firing squad to forcibly extract the deed to the lake house. With trembling fingers, I opened the first portable document format file attached to the email. It was a draft of a massive civil lawsuit prepared for the county probate court. As I scrolled through the dense, formal legal jargon, the true depravity of my parents' strategy began to reveal itself, sinking into my stomach like a lead weight. They were petitioning a judge to enact an emergency freeze on all of my personal assets and fully invalidate my late grandmother's will. The justification they had manufactured for this hostile takeover was absolutely sickening. Attached to the draft lawsuit were 3 fabricated medical affidavits. My father had somehow procured statements from a disgraced, heavily compensated physician, claiming that my grandmother was suffering from severe, undocumented dementia during the final 2 years of her life. The lawsuit alleged that I had engaged in predatory elder abuse. My own parents were formally accusing me of isolating a vulnerable, mentally incapacitated old woman and coercing her into leaving her $500,000 waterfront property exclusively to me. Tears of pure outrage blurred my vision as I read the vicious lies printed on the glowing screen. My grandmother had been the sharpest, most brilliantly lucid woman I had ever known, right up until her final breath. She had left me the lake house specifically to protect it from my father's reckless gambling disguised as business investments. To see her memory defiled, to see her portrayed as a confused, helpless victim just so my parents could steal her home and hand it to my spoiled sister, was a violation I could barely comprehend. But as my professional accounting background began to process the legal strategy, I realized the full scope of their financial trap. The four corporate lawyers knew perfectly well that these fabricated medical claims would likely fall apart under the rigorous scrutiny of a prolonged civil trial. But winning a trial was never their actual goal. Their goal was a war of absolute attrition. By filing a massive, complex probate dispute, they would tie up the lake house in an ugly legal gridlock for 3 to 5 years. I would not be able to sell it, rent it, or even access the equity. Meanwhile, I would be forced to hire my own legal defense team to fight 4 senior partners in court. They knew my financial situation. They knew I lived in a modest apartment and worked a standard corporate job. A 5-year probate nightmare would bankrupt me in legal fees within the first 8 months. They wanted to starve me out. They wanted to drain my bank accounts and exhaust my spirit until I was so desperate to stop the financial bleeding that I would willingly surrender the deed just to make the nightmare end. It was a brilliantly cruel strategy designed to crush a normal person under the immense weight of the American legal system. But as I scrolled to the second attachment in Jessica's email, I realized the lawsuit was only a backup plan. The true weapon they were aiming at my head was far more immediate and far more lethal. Please read the second document carefully, Jessica had warned in her email. They have no intention of actually filing the probate lawsuit today. It is an expensive prop for an ambush. They are going to use your professional license against you. I opened the second file. It was a formal, meticulously formatted complaint addressed directly to the State Board of Accountancy. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped reading and simply stared out the rain-streaked windshield of my car, struggling to process the sheer malice of what I was looking at. To a certified public accountant. The State Board is everything. They hold the absolute power over your career, your reputation, and your ability to earn a living. A formal ethics complaint involving financial fraud is an automatic trigger for a devastating investigation. It can lead to an immediate suspension of your license, public disgrace, and in severe cases, criminal prosecution. I forced my eyes back to the screen and read the fabricated allegations my parents had instructed their lawyers to draft. 3 years ago, when my father came to me weeping because his construction business was failing, I had drained my own hard-earned savings to pay off his $40,000 home equity line of credit. I had saved my family from foreclosure. I had handed over my financial security to protect their suburban lifestyle. Now, reading the draft complaint to the State Board, I saw how they had twisted my sacrifice into a weapon of mass destruction. The complaint alleged that I had unlawfully accessed my father's business accounts. It claimed that I had used my specialized skills as an accountant to embezzle $40,000 of his company funds, routing the money through my personal accounts to pay off the home equity line of credit, effectively framing me for corporate theft and money laundering. My father, the man whose debt I had cleared, was perfectly willing to sign a document stating that his own daughter was a white-collar criminal. The final paragraph of Jessica's email laid out the sequence of the ambush. "They are going to call you into a meeting under the guise of family mediation," Jessica wrote. "They will place the quitclaim deed to the lake house on the table alongside the complaint to the State Board of Accountancy. You will be given a choice. You can sign the deed over to Brittany and Chad immediately, or they will press send on the board complaint. They know you will not risk going to federal prison and losing the CPA license you worked your entire life to earn. They are absolutely certain you will surrender the property without a fight." I dropped my phone onto the passenger seat. The silence inside the car was deafening, broken only by the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the glass. I was entirely alone. My family had effectively placed a loaded gun to the temple of my career and my freedom. They had stolen my car, locked me out of my grandmother's belongings, and prepared a legal execution that would leave me homeless, jobless, and potentially incarcerated. The terror I felt in that moment was completely overwhelming. I felt like a little girl again, small, insignificant, and entirely at the mercy of my mother's demands and my father's rage. I squeezed my eyes shut, a sob tearing its way up my throat. I was supposed to be the dependable one. I was supposed to be the daughter who fixed everything. And this was my reward. But then the tears suddenly stopped. As I sat there in the cold, damp air of my car, the raw panic began to recede, washed away by a strange rising tide of absolute clarity. The terrified, obedient daughter, who had spent 31 years begging for her parents' approval, quietly stepped back into the shadows. In her place, the seasoned financial auditor stepped forward. I picked my phone back up. I did not look at the emotional betrayal of the documents. I looked at the raw data. I looked at the dates the specific legal statutes cited and the financial pathways they were threatening to exploit. I read through the fabricated timeline of the embezzlement complaint again. I scrutinized the wording of the proposed probate lawsuit regarding my grandmother's mental state, and as my eyes scanned the aggressive, overly confident text prepared by the 4 senior litigation partners, a slow, cold smile spread across my face. They had made a mistake. It was a brilliant plan built on intimidation and sheer force, but it contained a massive, fatal flaw. The 4 expensive lawyers had relied entirely on the arrogant, distorted narrative provided by my father. They had assumed that because my father was a loud, commanding businessman, his version of the financial history was accurate. They had assumed that a young single woman working at a mid-sized accounting firm would be too intimidated by their heavy legal letterhead to actually fight back. They had completely failed to verify the underlying federal tax implications of the properties involved. They had failed to check the precise chain of custody on the property records. And most disastrously of all, they had forgotten one fundamental truth about certified public accountants. We do not just crunch numbers. We leave impenetrable, meticulously documented paper trails. My father thought he could easily frame me for embezzlement because he treated his own business ledgers like a personal piggy bank. He assumed I operated the same way. He had completely forgotten that when I paid off his $40,000 debt 3 years ago, I had insisted on routing the payment directly from my verified, heavily audited personal savings account straight to the lending institution, completely bypassing his business accounts. There was a flawless, undeniable federal wire trail proving the money was mine. Furthermore, their attempt to challenge my grandmother's mental state was incredibly sloppy. My grandmother had anticipated their greed. She had not just quietly signed a will. She had executed the documents in the presence of an independent estate attorney, recorded the session on video, and submitted to a voluntary cognitive evaluation the very same day. Those records were safely sealed. My parents and their high-priced lawyers were walking into battle completely blind-armed with nothing but bluffs and fabricated evidence. They thought they had cornered a lamb. They had no idea they were threatening someone who understood the intricate mechanics of financial warfare better than they ever could. I wiped the last trace of moisture from my cheeks and started the engine of my car. The engine roared to life, the sound vibrating through the floorboards. I was not going to run. I was not going to surrender my grandmother's legacy, and I was certainly not going to let them destroy the career I had built with my own 2 hands. If they wanted to use the legal system to extort me, I would gladly play their game. I was going to accept their invitation to this little ambush. I was going to let them sit in their expensive boardroom, gloat over their fabricated complaints, and demand my signature. But I was not going to defend myself. Defense was for victims. Instead, I was going to spend the next 48 hours building a trap so legally complex, so completely devastating, and so airtight that by the time they realized they had stepped inside it, the doors would already be locked. My parents wanted to burn my life to the ground to save themselves. I was going to hand them the matches and let them set themselves on fire. The next morning, I walked into my managing partner's office before the sun was even fully up. I did not offer a detailed explanation, nor did I ask for permission. I simply stated that I was taking 3 days of emergency personal leave effective immediately. Given my flawless track record and the sheer number of billable hours I had logged over the past 4 years, he took one look at my pale, determined face and nodded. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the back of a rideshare heading straight for O'Hare International Airport. I booked a direct flight to Philadelphia, rented a car, and drove straight down into Wilmington, Delaware. Why Delaware? Because in the world of high finance and corporate law, Delaware is an absolute fortress. It is a jurisdiction built entirely around asset protection, corporate secrecy, and impenetrable trust structures. If you want to shield a valuable piece of property from hostile creditors, predatory lawsuits, or in my case, a desperate extortionist family armed with 4 aggressive litigation partners, you do not hire a local suburban attorney. You go to the architects of corporate defense. The law firm was located in a sleek, imposing glass high-rise downtown. I had spent the entire flight conducting fierce, targeted research, pulling favors from former colleagues in the financial sector until I found exactly the right person. His name was Robert Sterling. He was a senior partner specializing in complex wealth preservation and irrevocable federal trusts. He did not handle divorces or petty family squabbles. He handled high-net-worth individuals who needed their assets buried behind 10 miles of legal concrete. He cost $800 an hour, and he was worth every single penny. Robert was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit with silver hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not offer me a warm, patronizing smile when I sat down in his sprawling corner office. He simply folded his hands on his massive mahogany desk, looked at the thick stack of printed emails, property records, and the drafted state board complaint I had brought with me, and waited for me to speak. I laid out the entire situation with the clinical precision of a certified public accountant. I did not cry. I did not ask for sympathy. I told him about the $62,000 wedding demand. I told him about my father towing my car and locking me out of my grandmother's storage unit. I explained the conversation I had overheard at the church regarding the secret bankruptcy, the mechanic liens, and the federal payroll tax evasion. Finally, I pushed the fabricated state board complaint across the desk, explaining how they intended to weaponize my professional license to force me into signing away the deed to my grandmother's lake house. Robert listened in absolute silence. When I finished, he picked up the drafted state board complaint, his eyes scanning the aggressive legal threats manufactured by my father's lawyers. "Your father hired a team of sledgehammers," Robert finally said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "They are relying entirely on shock and awe. They expect you to panic because you are a young woman with a lot to lose, and they are 4 men with expensive letterheads. It is a classic intimidation play, but it is sloppy. It is incredibly sloppy because they are assuming the target will remain completely static." I leaned forward, gripping the armrests of my leather chair. "I am not static, Robert. I refuse to give them the lake house. It is the only thing my grandmother left me. But I cannot afford to be dragged into a 5-year probate war that will drain my bank accounts, and I absolutely cannot risk a fraudulent ethics investigation destroying my career. I need a shield. I need a wall so high and so thick that they break their hands trying to climb it." Robert smiled. It was a terrifying, brilliant smile. He opened a fresh legal pad and clicked his expensive silver pen. "We are not going to build a wall," Chloe, Robert said smoothly. "Walls can be scaled. Walls can be breached. We are going to make the target completely disappear." For the next 3 hours, Robert walked me through the intricate, airtight architecture of an irrevocable federal trust. In standard real estate scenarios, a person owns a house directly. Their name is on the deed, which means the property is legally tied to their personal financial identity. If they are sued, threatened, or extorted, that property is highly vulnerable because it belongs to them. My parents and their lawyers were banking on this exact vulnerability. They were preparing a quitclaim deed with my name printed directly at the top, waiting for my signature to transfer personal ownership from me to my sister Brittany and her wealthy fiancé. But an irrevocable trust completely changes the game. Robert explained that we were going to create a brand new, distinct legal entity. This trust would have its own tax identification number, its own operating agreement, and its own absolute legal sovereignty. I would be the grantor transferring the lake house into the trust. I could designate myself as a beneficiary, but the crucial mechanism, the absolute genius of the strategy, was that I would no longer be the legal owner of the property. "The moment you sign the transfer documents," Robert explained, tapping his pen against the desk for emphasis, Chloe the individual ceases to own that lake house. The trust owns it. Because it is an irrevocable trust, it cannot be undone, altered, or dissolved by outside forces. It creates an absolute legal barrier between your personal liability and the asset itself. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs as the magnitude of the strategy sank in. But what happens when my parents demand that I sign the quitclaim deed on Friday? What happens when their lawyers slide that paper across the table and threaten my career? Robert leaned back in his chair, a gleam of pure legal predatory anticipation in his eyes. When they demand your signature on Friday, you can gladly give it to them. Because by Friday, your signature on a personal real estate deed will be entirely worthless. You cannot legally transfer a property you no longer own. If you sign their quitclaim deed, you are signing a piece of paper that holds absolutely no legal weight. The county recorder will reject it immediately. The bank will reject it. Their $300,000 corporate bailout loan will collapse the second the underwriters pull the updated title history. They are aiming a bazooka at a ghost. The sheer brilliance of the maneuver washed over me, replacing my lingering fear with a profound sense of empowerment. It was the ultimate financial judo. I would not have to fight their lawyers over the validity of my grandmother's will. I would not have to scream, cry, or beg. I would simply remove the asset from the battlefield entirely, leaving them swinging their weapons at empty air. But there was a catch, and Robert made sure I completely understood the psychological weight of what I was about to do. You need to understand the reality of an irrevocable trust, Chloe. Robert set his tone, turning dead serious. You are legally disowning your grandmother's gift on a personal level. You will no longer hold the deed in your hands. You will surrender direct unilateral control of the property to the trust entity. To protect this house from your family, you have to let go of your personal ownership. Are you prepared to do that? I closed my eyes. I pictured the quiet, sunlit porch of the lake house. I remembered the smell of pine needles and old books. I remembered my grandmother sitting in her rocking chair holding my hand and telling me that she was leaving the property to me, so I would always have a safe harbor away from my parents' chaotic, demanding world. She did not leave me that house so it could be liquidated to pay off my father's criminal tax debts. She left it to me to protect me. Now it was my turn to protect her legacy. Yes, I said, opening my eyes and meeting Robert's intense gaze without a single flinch. Draft the paperwork. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of complex legal choreography. Because time was of the absolute essence, Robert mobilized his entire team of associates. They drafted the comprehensive trust documents, securing the necessary federal tax identification numbers and establishing the ironclad protective clauses that would govern the asset. We had to move with terrifying speed to ensure the property transfer was fully recorded with the county clerk back in my home state before my parents' lawyers formally filed any injunctions. I sat in Robert's conference room drinking endless cups of black coffee, reviewing every single line of the trust agreement. My accounting background allowed me to grasp the dense financial terminology, ensuring there were zero loopholes my father could exploit. We explicitly named an independent third-party corporate trustee based in Delaware to manage the asset, guaranteeing that even if my parents somehow tried to physically force me to alter the trust, I legally lacked the authority to do so. I was building a vault made of solid legal titanium. On Wednesday afternoon, the final documents were printed and arranged on the massive conference table. The paper felt heavy, loaded with the weight of my entire future. A notary public entered the room, setting her official seal down next to the stack of paper. Robert handed me his heavy silver pen. "This is the point of no return, Chloe," he said quietly. "Once the ink dries on this transfer, the lake house belongs to the trust. Your parents' extortion plot will be fundamentally broken." I did not hesitate. I took the pen and signed my name. I signed away my personal ownership to save my inheritance. Page after page, signature after signature, I systematically dismantled the leverage my family held over me. With every stroke of the pen, I felt a heavy toxic chain snapping in my chest. The suffocating anxiety that had gripped me since the night of that dreadful dining room ambush finally began to evaporate. When the final document was notarized, Robert immediately directed his paralegal to electronically file the transfer deed with the county recorder in my home state. We sat in silence for 20 agonizing minutes waiting for the confirmation. Finally, the paralegal walked back into the room holding a printed receipt. "The transfer has been successfully recorded," she announced. "The trust is now the sole legal owner of the property on public record." I let out a long, shuddering breath, burying my face in my hands for just a moment as pure, unadulterated relief washed through my body. The shield was in place. My grandmother's sanctuary was safe. If my father tried to seize it to pay off his looming federal tax evasion charges, he would hit a solid brick wall. If Chad's arrogant, wealthy parents tried to leverage the property for their corporate bailout, their underwriters would laugh them out of the bank. The $62,000 wedding invoice was nothing but a pathetic, desperate joke. Robert poured 2 glasses of sparkling water and slid one across the table to me. "Congratulations, Chloe. You just successfully outmaneuvered 4 senior litigation partners before they even realized the game had started." I took a slow sip of the cold water, feeling the victory settle into my bones. But as I looked at the drafted state board complaint my parents' lawyers had prepared, the sense of triumph morphed into something much sharper, something colder. Protecting the lake house was only half the battle. My parents were still perfectly willing to destroy my career, my reputation, and my freedom just to punish me for not capitulating to their demands. They had still stolen my car. They had still locked me out of my grandmother's storage unit. They were still fully intending to ambush me in a glass boardroom on Friday afternoon and threaten me with federal prison if I did not submit to their extortion. A shield was wonderful for defense, but I was not just trying to survive this encounter. I needed to ensure they could never, ever come after me again. I needed to neutralize them completely. I looked up at Robert. "The lake house is safe," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "But they do not know that yet. On Friday, they are still going to slide that quitclaim deed across the table. They are still going to hold that fabricated accounting complaint over my head and demand my signature." Robert tilted his head, studying me carefully. "And you are going to give them your signature, remember? We discussed this. You will sign a worthless document. Let them think they have won and watch their entire bailout deal collapse when the bank rejects the title. They will be ruined financially without you ever having to lift another finger." "That is not enough," I said flatly. Robert raised an eyebrow. "Not enough." "No." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the polished table. "If they simply fail to get the house, they will realize what I did. They will be furious, and they will retaliate. They will carry out their threat and file that fraudulent complaint with the State Board of Accountancy purely out of spite. Even if I can eventually prove the embezzlement charges are fabricated, fighting a state board investigation will completely derail my career. It will take months of auditing legal fees and professional humiliation to clear my name. I cannot allow them to walk out of that boardroom with the ability to destroy my livelihood." The seasoned trust attorney went perfectly still, realizing exactly what I was saying. "You want to strip them of their ammunition." "I do not just want to strip them of their ammunition, Robert. I want them to hand me the murder weapon with their own fingerprints on it." I tapped the terrifying, aggressive legal threat their lawyers had drafted. "They are trying to extort me. Extortion is a crime. But right now, it is just a, he said, she said family dispute. I need concrete, undeniable proof of their coercion. I need them to incriminate themselves so thoroughly that if they ever even look in my direction again, I can have them and their 4 expensive lawyers disbarred and arrested." Robert's eyes widened slightly, a flash of profound professional respect illuminating his features. "You want to build a trap?" "Yes," I said, the words solid and heavy in the quiet room. "The shield is in place. Now I need a sword. I need you to help me draft a document. They will eagerly sign a document that looks like a victory for them, but is actually a legally binding confession of federal extortion." The shield was secured. The asset was buried. But the real war was just beginning, and I was about to turn their arrogant ambush into an absolute slaughter. "We have work to do," Robert said, pulling a fresh legal pad toward him. "Let us build a poison pill." The trap was set. Now I just needed my parents and their ruthless legal team to walk right into it. The silence in Robert's office was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the city traffic drifting up from the streets of Wilmington far below. I sat across from the seasoned trust attorney, staring at the polished mahogany surface of his desk. We had just successfully shielded my grandmother's lake house by transferring the deed into an impenetrable federal trust. The defensive line was officially drawn. But as I looked at the drafted state board complaint, my parents' lawyers had sent me the malicious document that threatened to destroy my certified public accountant license and my entire livelihood. The adrenaline in my veins began to burn cold. A shield was no longer enough. I needed a sword. I looked Robert dead in the eye and told him I wanted to build a trap. I wanted my parents and their high-priced legal team to hand me their own written confession to federal extortion. Robert leaned back in his heavy leather chair, steepling his fingers together. A slow, deeply appreciative smile spread across his face. He had spent his entire career dealing with ruthless corporate raiders and high-net-worth families, tearing each other apart over inheritance money. He was clearly accustomed to clients who panicked, cried, or begged for mercy. He was not accustomed to a 31-year-old accountant sitting in his office calmly asking to construct a legal guillotine. "You want them to sign a confession?" Robert said, testing the weight of the idea. "You want them to voluntarily put their signatures on a document that explicitly outlines their own criminal liability. Chloe, you understand that these are 4 senior litigation partners we are dealing with. These men charge hundreds of dollars an hour to dissect contracts. They do not blindly sign anything." I shook my head, resting my hands firmly on the table. "They do not blindly sign contracts when they feel threatened." I corrected him. "They do not blindly sign when they respect the person sitting across the table. But they do not respect me, Robert. My father has spent my entire life treating me like an obedient, easily frightened workhorse. He has undoubtedly painted that exact picture for his legal team. He has told them I am weak, that I'm isolated, and that the moment they apply real pressure to my career, I will completely collapse." I leaned forward, tapping the fabricated board complaint with my index finger. "These lawyers are arrogant. They have stolen my car, locked me out of my storage unit, and threatened my freedom. They believe they have completely broken my spirit. When I walk into their office and hand them a settlement agreement, they are not going to see a trap. They are going to see a terrified, desperate woman begging for her professional life. They will look at the document and see exactly what they expect to see: a total, unconditional surrender." Robert raised an eyebrow, his professional curiosity fully engaged. "And as a financial auditor, how exactly do you plan to hide a federal confession inside a surrender document?" "By making it boring," I said flatly. In the world of corporate accounting, I explained to Robert, if a company wants to hide a massive fatal liability, they do not erase it. Trying to completely erase a discrepancy is how you trigger an immediate audit. Instead, you bury it. You hide the fatal number in the middle of a 400-page disclosure report. You surround it with mind-numbing boilerplate text, repetitive compliance jargon, and tedious regulatory clauses. You make the document so aggressively dull, so utterly predictable, that the auditor's brain simply glazes over it. People only read carefully when they are looking for a fight. When they think they have already won, they just skim to the bottom line to find the payout. Robert let out a sharp, genuine laugh. It was the sound of a man who truly loved his job. "You want to weaponize their own arrogance against them?" "Exactly," I replied. "I want you to draft a comprehensive settlement and release agreement. The first 5 pages need to give them every single thing their greedy hearts desire. I want sweeping declarations of my total submission. I want paragraphs where I formally agree to surrender the property, waive my rights to any future litigation, and assume full financial responsibility for their legal fees. We will feed their massive egos with every single sentence. We will make the document look like the ultimate victory lap for their law firm." Robert pulled a fresh legal pad toward him, his pen moving quickly as he began to outline the structure. "And the poison pill. Where do we bury the explosive? We put it right in the middle," I said, my voice steady and cold. deep inside the standard indemnification and jurisdictional clauses. Sections 7 or 8, buried under paragraphs of dense, completely standard legal formatting. I watched Robert as he began to map out the specific legal mechanism of our trap. We spent the next 4 hours locked in that office, meticulously weaving the greatest piece of financial deception I had ever touched. We called it the Mutual Release and Comprehensive Settlement Agreement. Just looking at the title made my eyes feel heavy. It was a masterpiece of corporate boredom. The first several pages were exactly as I had requested. It contained highly repetitive language about resolving family disputes, maintaining privacy, and surrendering real estate assets to avoid further emotional distress. It looked exactly like a document drafted by a terrified woman desperately trying to buy her way out of a lawsuit. But then came Clause 7. We titled it, Acknowledgement of Fiduciary Jurisdiction and Trustee Obligations. It was a heading designed to look like standard compliance filler, but the actual text beneath that boring heading was a loaded bomb. The clause explicitly stated that the parties signing the document fully acknowledged that the property in question was currently held within an irrevocable federal trust. It further stated that the signing parties willfully admitted to utilizing coercive tactics, specifically the threat of fraudulent professional licensing complaints, to attempt an unauthorized transfer of federal trust assets. By signing the document, my parents and their lawyers were formally agreeing that their actions constituted a direct violation of federal law, specifically outlining the statutes for conspiracy to extort and defraud a federal trust via mail and wire fraud. It was an absolutely lethal paragraph. If my parents signed it, they were admitting to federal extortion. But more importantly, if those 4 arrogant litigation partners co-signed the document as legal witnesses or representatives, they were formally tying themselves to a felony. They were providing written notarized proof that they had actively participated in a criminal conspiracy to defraud an irrevocable trust across state lines. It would mean the immediate permanent end of their legal careers and virtually guarantee federal indictments. Will this actually hold up in court? I asked, watching the printer spit out the final crisp pages of the agreement. If they claim they did not read it carefully before signing, does it still trap them? Robert gathered the warm pages, tapping them neatly against his desk. He looked at me with a grim, serious expression. In a standard consumer contract, a judge might show leniency if a normal person signed something they did not fully understand. But we are not dealing with normal consumers. We are dealing with 4 senior partners at a prominent corporate law firm. They are licensed legal professionals. The absolute cornerstone of their profession is the obligation to read and understand every document they endorse. A federal judge will laugh them out of the courtroom if they try to claim they accidentally signed a confession to wire fraud because they were too lazy to read page 7 of a settlement agreement. By putting their signatures on this paper, they are sealing their own fate. He slid the heavy bound document across the desk toward me. It felt dense. It felt like holding a weapon. You have your shield, Chloe, Robert said quietly, and now you have your sword. But you must execute this flawlessly. When you go into that room, you cannot show a single ounce of confidence. You cannot let the mask slip for even a fraction of a second. The moment they sense you are setting a trap, they will stop the meeting and review every comma of this document. You have to be the broken, defeated daughter they expect. I placed the settlement agreement carefully into my leather briefcase. I have spent my entire life making myself small so my family could feel big, I said, zipping the briefcase shut. Playing the victim for one more afternoon will not be a problem. I left Robert's office and took a cab straight to the airport. The flight back to Chicago was a blur of nervous exhaustion and intense mental rehearsal. I sat in my cramped economy seat, staring out the tiny window at the dark clouds gathering below. My mind kept flashing back to the church foyer, to my mother's artificial smile, to my father offering up my grandmother's home to save himself from prison. I thought about Brittany standing there examining her engagement ring while my life was being systematically dismantled to fund her luxury wedding. For 31 years, I had allowed them to dictate my worth. I had believed their narrative that I was simply a supporting character in the grand story of their lives, useful only when I was providing financial life support. I had absorbed their subtle insults, their blatant favoritism, and their endless demands, because I thought that was the price of belonging to a family. But as the plane touched down on the tarmac in Chicago, the landing gear rattling through the cabin, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. I was returning to a war zone, but I was no longer an unarmed civilian. I was a professional auditor carrying the legal equivalent of a nuclear code in my briefcase. I took a rideshare from the airport back to my apartment complex. The reality of my situation hit me the moment I walked up to my building. My designated parking spot was still completely empty. My reliable 10-year-old sedan was sitting in some private impound lot across the city, held hostage by my own father. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs to my modest one-bedroom apartment, unlocked the door, and stepped into the quiet darkness. The apartment felt exactly the same as I had left it, but I felt fundamentally different. I dropped my keys on the counter and turned on the small lamp in the kitchen. The yellow light cast long shadows across the inexpensive furniture I had bought from a thrift store years ago. My mother had always criticized my apartment, calling it depressing and unworthy of a professional woman. She never acknowledged that the reason I lived so frugally was because I was funneling all my disposable income into saving her home from foreclosure. I walked over to the small dining table and carefully pulled the bound settlement agreement from my briefcase. I set it down on the wood surface, staring at the crisp white pages. This document was the end of my family. I knew that with absolute certainty. Once I unleashed this trap, there would be no going back. There would be no awkward Thanksgiving dinners in the future. There would be no polite birthday texts. I was about to sever the bloodline completely, permanently, and violently. I placed my hand flat against the cover page. I waited for the familiar wave of guilt to wash over me. I waited for the small, frightened voice in my head to tell me that family was everything, that I should just surrender the property and keep the peace. The guilt never came. Instead, I felt a cold, hard resolve solidifying in my chest. My grandmother had worked her entire life to buy that lake house. She had scrubbed floors and saved every penny to create a beautiful sanctuary, and she had entrusted it to me because she knew I was the only one who would appreciate the sacrifice it represented. I was not going to let a team of predatory corporate lawyers steal her legacy to pay off my father's criminal debts. I was not going to let my sister turn my inheritance into a down payment for a country club wedding. I checked the clock on the microwave. It was nearing midnight. The dreaded Friday deadline was looming closer the day my parents' lawyers had demanded I appear at their office to sign away my property. But as I stood alone in my quiet kitchen, my professional instincts began to hum with a warning. I knew my parents. I knew their desperation. My father was facing federal tax charges, and Chad's wealthy parents were breathing down his neck for the collateral to secure the corporate bailout. Desperate people do not sit patiently in their offices waiting for a meeting. Bullies do not give their victims time to breathe, think, or seek outside counsel. They strike when you feel safe. They invade your space to establish dominance. They were not going to wait for Friday. They were going to try to break me before the meeting even happened. They wanted to humiliate me, isolate me, and ensure that by the time I walked into that glass boardroom, I was completely shattered. I carefully packed the settlement agreement back into my leather briefcase. I laid out my most professional gray suit for the morning. I set my alarm for 5:30. I knew exactly what was going to happen tomorrow. They were going to bring the war directly to my doorstep. They were going to march into my accounting firm, corner me in front of my colleagues, and try to publicly destroy me. They thought an ambush at my workplace would be the final crushing blow that forced my surrender. I turned off the kitchen lamp and walked into my bedroom, the darkness wrapping around me like a familiar blanket. I was terrified of the confrontation, but I was also entirely ready for it. I lay down, staring up at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise. The stage was set. The trap was loaded and the predators were circling the bait. Tomorrow I would look my abusers in the eye and I would smile. The accounting firm of Miller & Hayes was normally a sanctuary of absolute predictability. The soft, continuous hum of the central air conditioning combined with the rhythmic tapping of dozens of mechanical keyboards created a comforting blanket of professional routine. For 4 years, this open floor plan had been my safe harbor, away from the emotional chaos of my upbringing. I had built a sterling reputation among these quiet cubicles. My colleagues respected my work ethic. My managing partner trusted me with our most complex corporate clients. It was a world governed entirely by logic, mathematics, and strict order. There was no room for manipulation or deceit in a balanced ledger. I sat at my desk on Thursday morning staring blankly at a complex spreadsheet on my dual monitors, but my mind was operating on a completely different frequency. I knew my family was coming for me. I just did not know exactly when the strike would happen. At precisely 10:00 in the morning, the quiet, ordered sanctuary of my professional life was violently shattered. I heard a sharp, aggressive commotion near the front reception desk. The heavy glass double doors of our firm swung open with a loud, ringing thud that echoed across the silent floor. Every single head in the office turned toward the noise. I stood up slowly from my ergonomic chair, my heart performing a heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs as I looked down the long central aisle. My father was marching past the reception desk, completely ignoring the frantic protests of our elderly office manager. Thomas was wearing a dark, expensive tailored suit, his chest puffed out, radiating the aggressive arrogance of a man who firmly believed he owned every room he entered. My mother, Patricia, walked half a step behind him, her chin tilted upward, her designer handbag clutched tightly in her manicured hands. She wore an expression of severe manufactured disappointment, the precise kind of look a wealthy woman gives a deeply misbehaving servant. But it was the two men flanking them that made the air in the room turn instantly to ice. They were corporate litigation attorneys, and they looked exactly the part. They wore impeccably tailored charcoal suits, carrying thick leather briefcases and walking with the synchronized predatory stride of men who were paid thousands of dollars an hour to ruin lives. They did not look like they were there to politely negotiate a family misunderstanding. They looked like a corporate execution squad. My colleagues completely stopped typing. The entire floor went perfectly still. Telephones began to ring softly in the background, but nobody reached out to answer them. My managing partner, a strict, no-nonsense man named David, stepped out of his glass corner office, his brow furrowed in deep confusion and rising alarm. My parents were not just bringing a private family dispute to my workplace. They were staging a highly visible, calculated public humiliation. They wanted a captive audience. They wanted to strip away my professional dignity, surround me with aggressive men, and ensure that every single person I worked with believed I was a dangerous criminal. It was a brutal strategy designed to induce absolute paralyzing panic. My father marched directly down the central aisle, his heavy leather shoes thudding loudly against the carpet. He stopped right in front of my desk. The two lawyers immediately fanned out, deliberately blocking the narrow walkway and physically boxing me into my small cubicle space. My mother stood slightly to the side, crossing her arms and looking at me with a sickening mixture of pity and supreme disgust. I looked up at my father. He did not say hello. He did not lower his voice to preserve a shred of my privacy. He wanted the entire firm to hear every single word he had come to say. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, reached into his inner pocket, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila folder. He lifted it high into the air and slammed it down onto the center of my desk with a violent smack. The sudden sound made several of my coworkers physically jump in their seats. "We are done playing games with you, Chloe," my father barked, his voice booming across the silent office floor, bouncing off the glass walls. "You have tested our patience for the absolute last time. We tried to handle this quietly like a civilized family, but since you insist on being a greedy, ungrateful child, we have brought our legal counsel to handle you instead." One of the lawyers stepped forward, his eyes flat and devoid of emotion. He did not introduce himself. He simply placed a cold, heavily manicured hand on top of the manila folder. "Inside this file is a finalized legal complaint addressed directly to the State Board of Accountancy." The lawyer stated, his voice ringing with practiced theatrical authority. It details your unauthorized illegal access to your father's commercial business accounts. It outlines the specific methodology you used to unlawfully transfer $40,000 of his corporate funds to pay off a personal home equity line of credit. It is a comprehensive, heavily documented allegation of corporate embezzlement and federal wire fraud. A collective gasp echoed from the cubicles around me. I could physically feel the shocked, horrified stares of my coworkers burning into the side of my face. David, my managing partner, took a step forward, his mouth opening in righteous anger. But the second lawyer immediately held up a stiff warning hand to keep him back. "This is a private legal serving," the second lawyer announced loudly to the room. "I advise everyone to step back and remain clear of this desk." The first lawyer turned his predatory gaze back to me, his tone dropping to a sharp whisper that still carried perfectly. "If we submit this complaint to the state board, they will immediately suspend your certified public accountant license pending a full federal investigation. We have also prepared the corresponding civil lawsuits to freeze all of your personal banking assets by the end of the week. You will have no money, no license, and no career. You will be completely ruined." The sheer monumental audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were standing in the middle of my professional home accusing me of the exact financial crimes my father was currently committing and weaponizing my own sacrifice against me. I had drained my legitimate hard-earned savings to save his business from bankruptcy 3 years ago. Now he was twisting that lifeline into a noose and wrapping it tightly around my neck in front of everyone I respected. My mother let out a loud theatrical sigh, shaking her head sadly as she looked around the stunned office. "We are just so incredibly embarrassed," Patricia announced to my horrified colleagues, performing her role with sickening dedication. "We gave her everything. We paid for her beautiful life. And this is how she repays her own flesh and blood. She steals from her hard-working father just to spite her poor innocent sister." I looked back at my father. His face was flushed with the intoxicating thrill of absolute dominance. He leaned heavily over my desk, placing both of his large hands on the wood surface, physically trapping me in my chair. He lowered his face until he was only inches away from mine. I could smell the stale coffee and aggressive cologne radiating off his skin. "Listen to me very carefully," he snarled, his voice a low, gravelly threat. "Friday, 2:00 in the afternoon, at our lawyer's office downtown. You will walk through those doors, you will sign the quitclaim deed to the lake house over to your sister, and you will wire the $62,000 you owe us for the wedding." He lifted a thick, angry finger and tapped it hard against the manila folder on my desk. "If you are even one single minute late, or if you refuse to sign that deed, this complaint goes directly to the state board via certified courier at exactly 3:00. You will be in handcuffs by Monday morning. The choice is entirely yours. You can keep your little accounting job, or you can try to keep the house. You do not get to keep both." This was it. This was the deafening crescendo of their extortion plot. They had marched their expensive legal hitmen into my sanctuary, dropped a nuclear bomb on my professional reputation, and delivered the ultimate ultimatum. They expected me to completely break. They expected the quiet, accommodating daughter to finally shatter under the immense, crushing weight of public humiliation and legal terror. They expected a performance, and I was fully prepared to give them the greatest performance of my entire life. I let my shoulders collapse forward, violently curving my spine so I looked small, fragile, and utterly defeated. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, letting my chest heave with artificial, overwhelming panic. I thought about the sheer, unforgivable cruelty of this moment, the absolute betrayal of a mother and father trying to destroy their own child, and I let the genuine pain of that realization rise to the surface of my eyes. The tears came fast and hot. They were real tears born of a deep, lingering grief for the loving family I never truly had, but I expertly repurposed those tears into a mask of pure, blinding terror. I looked up at my father, letting my eyes go wide and frantic like a trapped animal. I raised my hands, ensuring they were shaking violently, and pressed them hard against my pale cheeks. "No," I gasped, my voice trembling and pathetically weak. "No, please. Please, Dad. You cannot do this. You cannot take my license. It is all I have. It is my whole life." My father straightened up, a look of profound, arrogant satisfaction washing over his rugged features. The bully had drawn blood, and he was absolutely reveling in the victory. I stood up slowly from my chair, my knees intentionally buckling slightly so I had to grip the sharp edge of the desk for physical support. I looked at the two cold lawyers, letting fresh, heavy tears spill down my face and ruin my carefully applied makeup. "Please do not send that file," I begged, letting my voice crack with perfectly pitched, agonizing desperation. "Please. I worked so hard for my certification. I studied for years. If you send that to the board, I will lose my job. I will go to jail. I do not have any money to fight you. I do not have anything left." My mother stepped forward, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the floor. She looked at my tear-stained, panicked face, and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across her perfectly painted lips. It was a smile of pure, toxic victory. She had finally put her disobedient daughter back in her place. She had finally crushed my defiant independence. "Then you know exactly what you need to do, Chloe," my mother said, her voice dripping with condescending, sugary sweetness. "You need to stop being a selfish, greedy little girl. You need to come to the office on Friday and do the right thing for your sister. We are your family. We are just trying to help you see reason." I covered my face with my trembling hands, letting out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed through the agonizingly quiet office. "I will sign it," I cried out, my voice muffled and broken behind my shaking fingers. "I will sign the deed. I will sign whatever you want on Friday. Please, just do not take my license." My father reached out and patted my shoulder. It was a heavy, patronizing touch that made my skin crawl with revulsion, but I forced myself to lean into it, playing the role of the broken, completely compliant victim to absolute perfection. "That is a good girl," my father said, his voice returning to its normal, booming volume. "We will see you on Friday at 2:00. Do not make us chase you down again." He turned to the two lawyers and gave a sharp, commanding nod. The execution squad had finished their brutal work. The lawyers picked up their expensive briefcases, turned sharply on their heels, and began marching back down the central aisle toward the glass doors. My father followed them, his chest puffed out with the supreme, blinding confidence of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen $500,000 without breaking a sweat. My mother lingered for just a fraction of a second longer. She looked around the office at my horrified, staring colleagues. She offered them a small, polite wave, exactly as if she were a visiting dignitary, excusing herself from a minor, unfortunate unpleasantness. Then she turned her back on my sobbing form and followed her husband out the door. The heavy glass doors swung shut behind them with a definitive click. The silence they left in their toxic wake was absolute and suffocating. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. I stayed slumped over my desk, my face buried in my hands, keeping my shoulders shaking to maintain the illusion. Then the spell finally broke. My coworkers suddenly rushed forward, a flurry of concerned voices and sympathetic hands reaching out to comfort me. David, my managing partner, pushed his way aggressively through the crowd, his face pale with deep shock and protective outrage. "Chloe." David said, his voice gentle but horrified. "Chloe, look at me. Are you all right? Do we need to call the police?" What on earth was that? I kept my hands over my face for another few seconds, letting out one final ragged theatrical breath. Then I slowly lowered my hands and looked up at my boss. My face was wet with tears, but my hands were no longer shaking. The frantic, hyperventilating panic had completely vanished. I looked at David, and then I looked at the heavy manila folder my father had left sitting in the exact center of my desk. "I am fine, David," I said. My voice was perfectly, flawlessly steady. The trembling, broken pitch was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, metallic calm that cut through the warm air of the office. My colleagues took a collective, involuntary step back, sensing the sudden jarring shift in my demeanor. The terrified, weeping daughter had disappeared the exact moment those glass doors clicked shut. The financial auditor was fully back online. David stared at me, completely bewildered by the instantaneous transformation. "Chloe, those men just threatened to report you for federal embezzlement. They threatened to have you arrested in front of your entire department. They are trying to brutally extort you for a piece of real estate. We have to report this. We have to fight this immediately." I reached out and placed my hand flat against the manila folder. I traced the smooth edge of the paper, a genuine, terrifying smile slowly spreading across my face. "Oh, we are going to fight it, David," I said softly, picking up the folder and turning it over in my steady hands. "But we are not going to call the police today." My coworkers exchanged worried, deeply confused glances. They had just watched my family burn my professional reputation to the ground, and they could not possibly understand why I was suddenly smiling like someone who had just won the lottery. They did not know about my emergency trip to Delaware. They did not know about the impenetrable, irrevocable federal trust currently shielding my property. And they did not know about the beautifully boring, lethally crafted settlement agreement currently waiting safely inside my briefcase. My family thought they had just delivered a flawless masterstroke of public intimidation. They thought they had backed a helpless, isolated animal into a corner, completely breaking my will to fight. They were absolutely certain that on Friday afternoon, I would walk into their pristine, imposing legal boardroom, cry a few more pathetic tears, and blindly sign over my grandmother's legacy to save my own skin. They had no idea that they had just sprinted headfirst into a trap made of iron and federal law. Friday at 2:00, I murmured, looking out the large office windows toward the downtown skyline where their expensive lawyers sat in their high-rise towers. I will definitely be there. The stage was perfectly set. The bait had been completely swallowed. The attackers were entirely blinded by their own arrogant, insatiable greed. They were expecting a tearful surrender. They were going to walk into an absolute, unmitigated slaughter. The polished steel elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the 44th floor of the downtown legal district. I stepped out onto plush gray carpet that seemed designed to absorb sound and suppress independent thought. The reception area was an intimidating expanse of white marble and brushed metal. A receptionist with a flawless smile and cold eyes asked for my name. I gave it to her softly, letting my shoulders stoop just a fraction of an inch. She directed me down a long corridor lined with frosted glass walls. My flat shoes made no noise against the carpet, but the erratic, frantic beating of my heart felt loud enough to echo. I was not walking into a meeting. I was walking into a calculated execution. At exactly 2:00 in the afternoon, I pushed open the heavy glass door to the main conference room. The space was massive, designed specifically to overwhelm and diminish anyone who entered alone. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, rendering the city below small and insignificant. A sprawling mahogany table dominated the center of the room, polished to a mirror shine. They were all waiting for me. They sat on one side of the massive table, presenting a unified, impenetrable wall of expensive fabrics and unearned arrogance. My father Thomas sat near the center, exuding the aggressive swagger of a man who believed he had already won the war. His suit was dark, his posture wide and commanding. Beside him sat my mother Patricia, wearing a crisp, tailored dress and an expression of profound boredom, as if my complete financial ruin was merely an inconvenient errand on her afternoon schedule. Further down the table sat my sister Brittany and her wealthy fiancé Chad. Brittany was busy scrolling on her phone, completely detached from the reality that she was participating in the extortion of her own sister. Chad looked annoyed to be there, checking his designer watch and sighing softly. But it was the 4 men flanking my family that commanded the true gravity of the room. These were the senior litigation partners Jessica had warned me about. They wore perfectly tailored suits and identical expressions of predatory confidence. They were legal mercenaries, men who spent their careers crushing small businesses and bankrupting ordinary people for sport. "Have a seat," Chloe, the lead lawyer, said. He did not introduce himself. He did not stand. He simply gestured to the single empty chair positioned on the opposite side of the vast mahogany table directly facing the firing squad. I walked slowly around the table, gripping the handle of my battered leather briefcase. I forced my hands to tremble slightly as I pulled out the heavy chair and sat down. I kept my eyes lowered, fixing my gaze on the polished wood in front of me. I drew in a ragged, shallow breath, letting my chest heave with what appeared to be overwhelming panic. Deep inside my mind, where the financial auditor lived, I was perfectly, completely calm. The Delaware Shield was fully secured. My grandmother's legacy was safe. But the physical vessel sitting in this chair had to play the role of the broken lamb. The lead lawyer leaned forward, folding his manicured hands, resting them on a thick stack of legal documents. "We are not going to waste our highly valuable time today, Chloe," he began, his voice smooth and lethally condescending. "Your father has outlined the current situation with total clarity. You have unlawfully acquired corporate funds belonging to his construction firm. You have utilized those funds for personal gain. We have drafted a comprehensive complaint detailing your embezzlement and wire fraud, ready to be submitted to the State Board of Accountancy. This board complaint will immediately suspend your professional license. The corresponding civil suits will freeze your personal checking and savings accounts by Monday morning." He paused, letting the heavy threat hang in the sterile air of the boardroom. "However, your family has graciously extended a final olive branch," he continued. "They are willing to overlook your gross financial misconduct and refrain from filing these devastating charges. In exchange, you will immediately transfer the title of the Lake House property to Brittany and Chad. You will also authorize a wire transfer of $62,000 to cover the damages you have caused this family." The lawyer reached into his thick file and extracted a single crisp, white document. He slid it across the vast expanse of the mahogany table. It stopped directly in front of me. It was the quitclaim deed, the legal instrument designed to strip me of my inheritance. "Sign the deed," the lawyer commanded softly. "Wire the funds. Walk out of this building and keep your career. If you refuse, we will completely dismantle your life before the sun sets today." I stared down at the quitclaim deed. I let my hands shake, visibly resting them on the edge of the table. I looked up at the wall of faces opposing me. My father was grinning a tight, victorious smile. Chad was looking at his phone again, entirely unbothered. "I cannot believe you are doing this," I whispered, forcing my voice to crack and waver. "You are my family. I paid your debts. I saved you from foreclosure 3 years ago." A second lawyer sitting to the left of my father let out a harsh, dismissive scoff. "Family loyalty is a two-way street, young lady. You have isolated yourself. You have hoarded property that rightfully belongs to the collective family unit. Your father is simply reclaiming what is ethically his to distribute. Do not sit there and play the victim when you have actively tried to steal your sister's future." I shifted my gaze to my mother. Patricia was staring at me with cold, reptilian eyes. She leaned forward, placing her elbows on the table, her designer jewelry clinking softly against the wood. "Stop making this hard, Chloe." My mother sneered, her voice dripping with venomous impatience. "You were born to support this family. It is what you are good at. You have a job. You can easily make back whatever money you lose today. Brittany is starting a legacy with Chad. She needs that house. Stop being so incredibly selfish and just sign the paper." Her words hit me with the force of a physical blow. You were born to support this family. It was the purest distillation of my entire existence in her eyes. I was not a human being. I was a utility. I was a financial battery to be drained whenever they required a charge. For 31 years, that foundational truth had slowly eroded my self-worth. But hearing it spoken aloud in this sterile corporate room surrounded by hired mercenaries did not break me. It liberated me entirely. I dropped my head, letting a loud, pathetic sob escape my lips. I brought my trembling hands up to cover my face, hiding my features behind my fingers. I allowed my shoulders to shake violently, weeping with loud, ragged gasps that echoed off the glass walls. "Please," I cried out, my voice muffled and broken. "Please do not send that complaint to the board. I beg of you. I worked my entire life for that certification. If I lose my license, I will have absolutely nothing. I will go to prison. I cannot go to prison." My father chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound that filled the room. "Then pick up the pen. Chloe, Sign the deed. It is a very simple transaction. I lowered my hands, wiping the artificial tears from my flushed cheeks. I looked at the lead lawyer, my eyes wide and frantic with manufactured terror. I will sign the deed. I whispered, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form the words. I will give you the house. I will give you everything you want. But you have to promise me. You have to swear you will not destroy my career. I need it in writing. I cannot just trust that you will not send that file tomorrow or next week. I need protection. The four lawyers exchanged amused, condescending glances. They were looking at a terrified, cornered animal begging for a scrap of safety. They were completely blinded by their own supreme arrogance, by the absolute certainty that they had crushed my will to resist. The lead lawyer smiled a thin, predatory line. We are not in the habit of negotiating with embezzlers, Chloe. You are in no position to make demands. I reached down into my battered leather briefcase. My hands were shaking so wildly that I fumbled with the zipper. I pulled out the thick bound document that Robert and I had meticulously crafted in Delaware. I pushed it across the mahogany table with jerky, spastic movements. It slid until it bumped against the edge of the quit-claim deed. I cannot sign your deed until you sign this, I pleaded, my voice rising in a desperate, panicked pitch. It is just a settlement agreement. It just says that I am surrendering the property to avoid further litigation, and that you fully promise never to sue me or threaten my certified public accountant license again. It is a standard waiver. I just need to know I am safe. Please, I will sign the deed right after you sign this. The lead lawyer sighed heavily, rolling his eyes as he picked up my beautifully boring, lethally crafted document. He adjusted his expensive glasses and flipped open the cover page. I held my breath. The real Chloe, the financial auditor sitting quietly beneath the weeping facade, watched him with razor-sharp focus. This was the most critical moment of my entire life. If he was a diligent attorney, he would read every single page. He would find Clause 7 buried deep in the dense, repetitive boilerplate text. He would see the words, acknowledgement of fiduciary jurisdiction and trustee obligations. He would read the explicit admission of utilizing coercive tactics to force the unauthorized transfer of an irrevocable federal trust asset. He would instantly realize that signing that document constituted a formal written confession to conspiracy to extort and defraud a federal trust via mail and wire fraud. If he read Clause 7, the trap would fail. I would be escorted out of the building and the war would continue. But he did not read Clause 7. He was a senior litigation partner billing $800 an hour dealing with a crying junior accountant. He was absolutely convinced of his own intellectual superiority. He believed he had already won the battle the moment I walked through the glass doors. He skimmed the first 2 pages, seeing exactly what I had designed him to see. He saw sweeping declarations of my total submission. He saw paragraphs where I formally agreed to surrender the real estate and waive my rights to future litigation. He saw the ultimate victory lap for his law firm. He did not read the middle pages. He simply flipped to the very end of the thick packet, arriving at the signature page. He let out a short, barking laugh, dropping the packet back onto the table. It is exactly as you said, Thomas. She is incredibly paranoid. He looked across the table at me, shaking his head in sheer amusement. This is a highly redundant and poorly drafted release form, Chloe. But if it makes you feel better to have a meaningless piece of paper protecting your precious license, we will humor you. We just want this matter concluded today. The lawyer reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a heavy silver pen. He clicked it once. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet room. He leaned over the document and slashed his signature across the witness line. The trap snapped shut. The lead lawyer slid the document to the associate beside him, who quickly signed his name without bothering to read a single word. They passed the packet down the line of suits. Each highly educated, incredibly expensive attorney signed their name to a federal felony confession without a second thought. They were so eager to close the deal, so desperate to secure the massive corporate bailout for my father, that they completely abandoned their professional obligations. The document finally reached my father. Thomas grabbed the pen with a victorious grunt, signing his name with wide, aggressive strokes. He pushed the packet to my mother. Patricia smiled at me, a cold, triumphant smirk spreading across her face as she delicately signed her name on the bottom line. My mother pushed the fully executed settlement agreement back across the table toward me. It sat there next to the quitclaim deed, a perfectly legal notarized confession of federal extortion signed by the perpetrators and witnessed by their own legal counsel. Now the lead lawyer said, folding his hands back together, "We have humored your paranoia. Sign the deed, Chloe. Give your sister her house." I looked down at the two documents. I slowly pulled the settlement agreement toward me, sliding it safely back into my leather briefcase. The bomb was secure. I picked up the pen they had provided. I let my hand shake one final time as I hovered the tip over the signature line of the quitclaim deed. I looked at the blank space. I was about to sign away my personal ownership of the lake house. But because I had already legally transferred the property into the Delaware Federal Trust 48 hours ago, my signature on this personal deed was completely legally worthless. I was signing a ghost document. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name. I pushed the quitclaim deed back across the table. The lead lawyer snatched it up, immediately inspecting the signature with a satisfied nod. "Excellent." He placed the deed into his thick manila folder and closed it. "The property transfer will be filed with the county clerk first thing Monday morning. Thomas, your bailout loan can proceed as planned." My father let out a massive, booming exhale of pure relief. He slumped back in his chair, the invisible weight of federal prison lifting off his shoulders. My mother clapped her hands together in a sharp staccato rhythm of victory. Further down the table, Brittany actually giggled. She leaned into Chad, wrapping her arms around his shoulder. "We finally have our house," she squealed, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I need to call the interior designer right now." I stood up slowly from my chair. I picked up my briefcase, gripping the handle tightly. I did not say another word. I turned my back on the firing squad and walked toward the heavy glass door. "Remember, Chloe," my father called out behind me, his voice thick with arrogant triumph. "You have until Monday to wire that $62,000. Do not make us send that complaint to the board. We own you now." I pushed open the door and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The heavy glass swung shut behind me, cutting off the sound of my family celebrating my absolute destruction. I walked steadily toward the elevators. My hands were no longer shaking. The tears had completely dried, leaving my skin tight and cold. I pressed the call button, watching the digital numbers descend from the upper floors. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully stolen my grandmother's legacy, saved their bankrupt company, and permanently secured my terrified obedience. They were currently sitting in a glass fortress celebrating a multi-million-dollar fraud based entirely on a worthless signature. I stepped into the empty elevator and watched the metal doors slide shut, blocking out the corporate law firm. I was going to let them enjoy their weekend. I was going to let them pop champagne at the country club and brag to their wealthy friends about their new waterfront property. I was going to let those 4 arrogant lawyers bill my father for thousands of dollars in legal fees, because on Monday morning, when their junior clerk attempted to file that fraudulent quitclaim deed with the county recorder, the entire illusion was going to shatter. The bank would instantly cancel the bailout loan. The IRS would be notified, and the federal authorities would receive a very interesting package containing a legally binding confession of extortion signed by every single person in that room. The lamb had left the building. The wolf was going to finish the job. The heavy silence of the boardroom was suddenly broken by the sharp metallic click of my father's expensive silver pen hitting the polished mahogany table. The black ink on the quitclaim deed was barely dry, but the atmosphere in the room had already violently shifted from tense, aggressive anticipation to a suffocating blanket of arrogant victory. My mother let out a long, theatrical breath. She seemed to have been holding for days, her rigid shoulders dropping as she leaned back in her plush leather chair. Thomas was openly beaming, his chest puffed out, so far the buttons on his tailored suit jacket looked visibly strained. He genuinely believed he had just successfully bullied his way out of federal tax evasion. He firmly believed he had won. At the far end of the massive table, Brittany was whispering excitedly to Chad, pointing a manicured finger at the signed deed as if it were a winning lottery ticket. The four senior litigation partners were already moving on, mentally shifting their gears back to their lucrative billable hours. The lead lawyer reached out with a perfectly steady hand to slide the worthless piece of paper into his thick leather briefcase. His face was a mask of total unbothered superiority. I stood there holding the handle of my battered bag, watching them celebrate my manufactured destruction. I was supposed to turn around and walk out the door, a broken, defeated woman. I had barely taken a single step toward the exit when the massive frosted glass door of the conference room swung violently inward. It did not just open politely. It was pushed wide with a smooth, commanding force that instantly sucked all the remaining air out of the room. The celebration at the table died immediately. Two men stepped over the threshold, crossing from the quiet hallway into the tense air of the boardroom. The first was Robert Sterling. My high-powered Delaware trust attorney looked entirely different here than he had in his own quiet office. In this room, surrounded by aggressive local litigation partners, he looked like an apex predator stepping into a cage full of very loud, very ignorant scavengers. He wore a dark, immaculate suit that made the other lawyers look underdressed. His silver hair caught the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows, and his eyes swept over the table with a cold, calculating precision that made my father physically recoil in his chair. Walking half a step behind Robert was a man I had never seen before, but whose presence was immediately intimidating. He was solidly built, wearing a conservative gray suit and carrying a plain black folio. He possessed the quiet, alert stillness of law enforcement. He did not look at my parents. His eyes were locked directly on the four lawyers sitting along the wall. "Excuse me," the lead lawyer snapped, recovering his voice and standing up from his chair, his face flushing with immediate defensive anger. "This is a private legal closing. You cannot just barge into this boardroom. I need you to leave immediately, or I will have security remove you from the premises." Robert did not stop walking. He did not even blink at the threat. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace until he reached the very edge of the mahogany table standing right beside me. He placed one hand on the polished wood and offered a smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "I highly doubt you will be calling security, Counselor Robert," said his low, gravelly baritone, silencing the entire room. "My name is Robert Sterling. I am the senior partner at Sterling & Vance, specializing in federal trust law, and I am here representing my client, Chloe." My father let out a harsh, dismissive bark of laughter. "Your client?" he sneered, pointing a thick finger at me. "Chloe does not have the money to hire a downtown paralegal, let alone a senior trust attorney. She just signed the property over to us," Thomas declared, crossing his arms aggressively. "You are about 10 minutes too late, pal. The deal is completely finished." Robert slowly turned his head to look at my father. He looked at him the way a scientist might examine a particularly unpleasant insect under a microscope. "Is that so?" Robert murmured, stepping forward and reaching his hand out toward the lead lawyer. "May I see the deed you just forced my client to sign?" The lead lawyer hesitated, his eyes narrowing suspiciously, but his arrogant confidence won out. He slid the document back across the table. "It is fully executed and notarized," he stated firmly. "The property legally belongs to Brittany and Chad now. Your presence here is entirely irrelevant." Robert picked up the quitclaim deed, holding it by the very edge of the paper. He adjusted his suit jacket, pulling a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket. He spent 10 agonizingly slow seconds reviewing the document while the entire room watched him in breathless silence. I could see the thick veins standing out on my father's neck. My mother was gripping the armrests of her chair so tightly her knuckles were pure white. Robert lowered the paper and looked directly at the lead lawyer. "Congratulations," Robert said, his voice echoing sharply off the glass walls. "You have just successfully coerced a signature for a piece of real estate that my client has not personally owned for nearly 3 weeks. The lead lawyer frowned, his thick eyebrows knitting together in sudden confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. We pulled the county records on Wednesday. Her name is on the title. Her name was on the title, Robert corrected smoothly, tossing the quitclaim deed back onto the center of the table like a piece of garbage. But as any competent attorney should know, county records often have a 48-hour processing delay. If you had bothered to do a simple federal asset check this morning before ambushing my client with fraudulent embezzlement threats, you would have discovered the truth. Robert leaned forward, planting both hands flat on the table. 3 weeks ago, Chloe legally transferred the entire Lake House property into an irrevocable federal trust domiciled in the state of Delaware. She completely dissolved her personal ownership of the asset. She is no longer the legal title holder. The trust is. Therefore, the personal quitclaim deed you just bullied her into signing is a completely worthless ghost document. It carries exactly the same legal weight as a cocktail napkin. The silence that followed Robert's words was absolute and deafening. It was the distinct sound of a carefully constructed reality completely shattering into a million sharp, jagged pieces. My father was the first to physically react. He lunged forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "That is a lie." Thomas roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You are lying. You cannot just hide a house in a trust. I know the law. We are filing that deed on Monday morning and taking that property." Robert did not even flinch at the outburst. "You will file nothing, Thomas," he replied, his tone dropping to a deadly whisper. "Because if you attempt to file a fraudulent deed against a protected federal trust, you will trigger an automatic federal investigation. The bank you are desperately relying on for your corporate bailout loan will run the required title trace. They will instantly see the Delaware trust entity. They will deny your $300,000 line of credit, and your construction company will be liquidated to pay your criminal tax debts before the end of the month. You have completely lost." I watched my mother, Patricia, slowly sink back into her chair. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn since I walked into the room was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. She turned her head slowly, looking at my father with wide, terrified eyes. The illusion of their wealth, the very foundation of their country club lifestyle, was evaporating right in front of her. Brittany, sitting at the far end of the table, let out a loud, dramatic gasp. She dropped her phone, staring at me with genuine outrage. But the wedding, she practically shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical whine. "Chad, what about our house? They promised us that house." Chad did not answer her. He had pushed his chair away from the table, putting physical distance between himself and my toxic family. He was a rich young man who had expected an easy real estate handout, not a federal financial scandal. He looked at my father with absolute disgust, already calculating how quickly he could cancel the engagement and escape this nightmare. The lead lawyer, however, was not focused on the family drama. His arrogant demeanor had completely vanished, replaced by the frantic, rapid calculations of a cornered professional. He looked at the worthless quitclaim deed, and then he looked up at Robert, his face pale and sweating profusely. "Fine," the lead lawyer spat, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "So the deed is void. You hid the asset. Very clever, counselor. But you are forgetting one massive detail." The lawyer grabbed the thick manila folder containing the fabricated state board complaint and held it up like a weapon. "Your client is still facing a massive ethical and criminal investigation. She stole $40,000 from her father's business. If she does not find a way to satisfy our financial demands today, this complaint goes to the State Board of Accountancy. She will lose her license. She will go to jail. Trust or no trust, she is still completely ruined." I felt a cold, dark smile pull at the corners of my mouth. I had been waiting for this exact moment. I had endured days of terror, public humiliation, and emotional abuse for this precise second in time. Robert did not look worried. He looked absolutely delighted. He turned to me and gave a small, imperceptible nod. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the heavy-bound settlement agreement. The document they had all eagerly signed just 10 minutes ago, believing it was my ultimate written surrender. I placed it gently on the table and slid it toward Robert. Robert placed his hand flat against the cover page. He looked down the line of the 4 highly paid corporate attorneys, letting the silence stretch out agonizingly long. "You are a senior litigation partner," Robert finally said, addressing the lead lawyer directly. "I assume you bill your clients an astronomical hourly rate to ensure their legal safety. I assume you pride yourself on your meticulous attention to detail." The lead lawyer swallowed hard, his eyes darting down to the document under Robert's hand. "What is your point?" he demanded, his voice losing its forceful edge. "My point," Robert continued smoothly, picking up the thick packet and flipping directly to page 7, "is that arrogance is a catastrophic professional liability. You were so eager to crush a young woman you perceived as weak, so desperate to secure a fraudulent real estate transfer, that you completely failed to read the document you just signed." Robert flattened the document on the table, pointing a silver pen at the center paragraph. "I advise you to read Clause 7, Robert instructed softly. "I advise you to read it out loud for the room." The lead lawyer leaned forward, pulling the document toward him. The other 3 attorneys crowded around his shoulders, their eyes scanning the dense legal text. I watched their faces carefully. It was like watching a slow-motion car crash. The initial confusion morphed into sudden dawning comprehension. The color rapidly drained from all 4 of their faces, leaving them looking like wax figures. One of the junior partners actually let out a quiet, horrified moan and took a stumbling step backward away from the table. "What does it say?" my father demanded, slamming his fist against the wood. "Stop staring at it and tell me what it says." The lead lawyer could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His hands were shaking so violently, the heavy paper rattled against the mahogany surface. "Allow me," Robert offered, his voice ringing with absolute undeniable authority. Clause 7 specifically stipulates that by signing this agreement, all parties involved formally acknowledge that the property in question is held within an irrevocable federal trust. It further states that the signing parties willfully admit to utilizing coercive illegal tactics, namely the explicit threat of filing a fabricated and fraudulent professional licensing complaint to attempt an unauthorized transfer of federal trust assets. Robert paused, letting the devastating reality of the words sink deeply into the minds of the men who had just signed their own death warrants. In simple terms, Robert explained, looking directly into the terrified eyes of the lead lawyer. "The quitclaim deed you bullied her into signing is legally void. However, this settlement agreement you all just eagerly endorsed as witnesses and participants is completely legally binding. You have just provided written, notarized, and witnessed confessions to conspiracy to extort and defraud a federal trust via mail and wire fraud." The air in the boardroom turned completely toxic. My father stumbled back, falling heavily into his chair, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. My mother covered her face with her hands, letting out a low, continuous wail of despair. They had built an elaborate trap to steal my future, and they had just locked themselves inside it. But the true devastation was reserved for the 4 legal mercenaries sitting across the table. They had not just lost a case. They had actively documented their participation in a severe federal felony. They had weaponized their law licenses to commit extortion, and they had signed a confession proving it. The room felt like it was vibrating with the sheer force of their collective panic. The 4 lawyers were looking at each other silently, calculating how many years in federal prison they were facing. My parents were completely paralyzed, realizing that their corporate bailout was gone, their daughter was untouchable, and they had just handed the federal government a written confession to extortion. But the final nail in the coffin was yet to be delivered. The solidly built man in the conservative gray suit who had entered the room behind Robert finally stepped forward. He moved with quiet, absolute authority, stopping right next to the shattered lead lawyer. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small black leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a shining silver badge. "My name is Agent Davis," the man announced, his voice carrying the heavy, uncompromising weight of formal law enforcement. "I am a senior investigator for the State Board of Accountancy and a liaison to the Federal Financial Crimes Task Force." The lead lawyer let out a choked, agonizing gasp, physically recoiling from the silver badge. "Mr. Sterling contacted my office yesterday morning regarding an active extortion plot involving a licensed, certified public accountant. Agent Davis explained, looking down the line of terrified attorneys, "I was brought here today to formally witness the execution of this document." Agent Davis reached out and calmly picked up the signed settlement agreement from the table, sliding it securely into his plain black folio. "As licensed attorneys, you are officers of the court," Agent Davis continued, his eyes locking onto the lead lawyer. "By forcing a citizen to surrender assets under the direct threat of a fabricated professional complaint, you have not only violated the fundamental ethics of your profession, you have explicitly implicated yourselves in a severe federal felony." The color completely vanished from the faces of the four lawyers, leaving them pale and sweating profusely under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom. "Your careers are effectively over, gentlemen," Agent Davis stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And I strongly suggest you retain independent criminal defense counsel before the end of the day." The heavy, asphyxiating silence that followed Agent Davis's announcement felt like the sudden vacuum of space before a catastrophic explosion. For 10 agonizing seconds, absolutely no one in that sprawling, glass-enclosed boardroom moved a single muscle. The four highly paid litigation partners sat frozen in their plush leather chairs, their faces drained of every drop of color, looking exactly like men who had just watched their prestigious careers evaporate into thin air. Then the spell broke, and the absolute chaos of self-preservation took over. The lead attorney, the man who just minutes ago had been leaning over this polished mahogany table threatening me with federal prison, suddenly sprang to his feet as if the chair had caught fire. His previous mask of smug, predatory confidence was completely gone. In its place was the wild, unhinged panic of a cornered animal. His hands trembled violently as he grabbed his expensive fountain pen and shoved it into his briefcase, followed blindly by stacks of scattered papers. "We were deliberately misled," the lead lawyer shouted, his voice cracking with a high, desperate pitch as he pointed a shaking finger directly at my father. "We were completely lied to by our own clients. They assured us they had full, unencumbered legal right to that property. They swore the asset was free and clear. We had absolutely zero knowledge of any federal trust, and we categorically deny any intent to participate in extortion." My father blinked heavily, completely blindsided by the sudden betrayal. Thomas reached out a thick hand, grabbing the sleeve of the lawyer's custom-tailored jacket. "What are you doing?" my father demanded, his voice thick with confusion and rising terror. "You cannot just abandon us right now. We paid your retainer. You work for me. You are supposed to fix this mess." The lawyer violently yanked his arm away, treating my father's touch as if it were a highly contagious disease. "I do not work for you anymore, Thomas," he spat, his eyes wide and frantic as he looked toward Agent Davis and Robert. "Effective immediately, our firm is formally withdrawing as your legal counsel. We are severing all professional ties. We will be filing the necessary paperwork with the court within the hour. Do not ever contact our offices again." The other three attorneys did not waste a single second. They scrambled to their feet, practically falling over one another to distance themselves from my parents. They zipped their leather briefcases with loud, jagged sounds, muttering their own frantic agreements and formal withdrawals. They were seasoned corporate sharks, and they knew exactly when there was blood in the water. They were actively throwing my parents to the wolves in a desperate, groveling attempt to save their own law licenses. My mother, Patricia, finally found her voice. She stood up, her perfectly styled hair trembling as she tried to summon her usual country club authority. "You cannot just leave us here," she shrieked, her voice shrill and grating against the glass walls. "We are respectable people. You cannot let them do this to us. Do you know who we are?" Nobody cared who they were. The four lawyers practically sprinted for the heavy glass doors, pushing past one another in a pathetic display of cowardice. The door swung shut behind them, sealing my parents inside the wreckage of their own spectacular failure. They were completely alone. They had no legal representation, no corporate bailout, and no leverage remaining. They were entirely defenseless, trapped in a room with a federal trust attorney and a state investigator who held their written, notarized confessions to a major felony. I sat back in my chair, resting my hands comfortably on the cool mahogany table. I looked at the man and woman who had spent my entire life making me feel small, invisible, and inadequate. I watched the profound, devastating reality of their situation crash down upon them. My father slowly sank back into his chair, his broad shoulders collapsing inward. His face had turned a dangerous shade of purple, and a thick layer of sweat coated his forehead. He was staring blankly at the empty space where his expensive lawyers had been sitting, realizing that his construction firm was completely dead and federal charges were absolutely imminent. But my work was not entirely finished. At the far end of the table, Chad was already sliding his chair backward, carefully creating physical distance between himself and my family. He looked deeply disturbed by the legal meltdown he had just witnessed, but he was still operating under the assumption that this was simply a messy business dispute. He still believed he was marrying into a wealthy, somewhat eccentric family. He did not yet know the true depth of the rot. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my smartphone. The screen glowed brightly in the dim light of the overcast afternoon. I unlocked it, navigating smoothly to my saved audio files. Since we are embracing a spirit of total absolute honesty today, I said, my voice ringing out clear and perfectly calm across the massive room. I think it is only fair that everyone involved understands exactly what they are signing up for. I shifted my gaze directly to Chad. He froze his eyes, locking onto mine with sudden sharp apprehension. Brittany, noticing my attention on her fiancé, let out a nervous, defensive scoff. "What are you talking about now, Chloe?" my sister whined, trying to sound dismissive but failing to hide the tremor of genuine fear in her voice. "Just leave us alone. Have not you done enough damage for one day?" I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on the wealthy young man who thought he was buying into a legacy. "Chad," I said softly, navigating to my contacts list. "I think your parents deserve to hear exactly how my family discusses your upcoming marriage behind closed doors. I think they deserve to know what this real estate demand was truly funding." My mother let out a sharp, breathless gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in sudden, terrifying comprehension. She remembered the church. She remembered the quiet conversation in the empty sanctuary. "Chloe, no," Patricia pleaded, her voice dropping into a pathetic, desperate whisper. "Please do not do this. I am begging you as your mother." I felt absolutely nothing. The woman begging me right now was the exact same woman who had smirked at my manufactured tears just 48 hours ago. She was the woman who had happily tried to destroy my accounting career to fund a lavish wedding. The time for mercy had expired long ago. I hit the forward button on the audio recording. I selected Chad's contact information along with the phone numbers for his mother and father, which I had easily pulled from the wedding planning spreadsheet Brittany had carelessly emailed me months ago. I pressed send. The digital swoosh of the outgoing message echoed softly from my phone speaker. 3 seconds later, a loud, intrusive ping sounded from the inner pocket of Chad's designer suit jacket. The sound hung in the air like the tolling of a funeral bell. Chad reached into his jacket, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. He pulled out his phone, staring at the notification on his lock screen. He tapped it, bringing the phone up closer to his face. The boardroom was so agonizingly silent that we could all faintly hear the audio file begin to play through the small speaker of his phone. We could hear the distinct echoing acoustics of the church. And then we heard my mother's voice, crisp and undeniable, playing directly into Chad's ear. We could hear Patricia clearly explaining that my father's business was completely bankrupt. We could hear her casually detailing the fraudulent scheme to steal my home. And most devastatingly, we heard her refer to Chad's wealthy parents as nothing more than a convenient, unsuspecting piggy bank to save their own social status. I watched Chad's face as he listened to the reality of his future in-laws. The mild annoyance he had carried all afternoon vanished instantly. The color rapidly drained from his cheeks, replaced by a tight, rigid mask of absolute fury. His jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscles twitching beneath his skin. He realized in real time that he was not the prize in a grand romance. He was the target of a desperate, calculated financial extraction. The audio file finished playing. Chad slowly lowered his phone, his hand gripping the device so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stood up from the mahogany table. His movements were slow, deliberate, and radiating an intense, freezing anger. He did not look at my parents. He slowly turned his head to look down at Brittany. My sister was completely paralyzed. Her mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water, desperately trying to formulate a lie and excuse any possible string of words that could save her perfect, wealthy future. "Chad?" she stammered, reaching out a trembling hand to touch his arm. "Chad, please listen to me. That is taken completely out of context. My mother was just stressed. You know how she gets. Please." Chad violently recoiled from her touch, stepping back as if her skin were made of acid. He looked at her with a level of pure, unadulterated disgust that made my own breath catch in my throat. "Do not ever touch me again," Chad stated, his voice low and vibrating with raw contempt. "The wedding is permanently canceled. Do not call my phone. Do not come to my house. If any of you ever attempt to contact my family again, my father's legal team will bury you so deep you will never see daylight." He did not wait for a response. He turned sharply on his heel and stormed toward the exit. The heavy glass door slammed open and he marched down the quiet carpeted hallway without looking back a single time. Brittany let out a sound that I had never heard a human being make before. It was a raw, primal wail of absolute devastation. Her knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed entirely onto the plush gray carpet of the boardroom, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. The lavish wedding, the country club membership, the effortless, wealthy lifestyle she felt entirely entitled to had just evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Patricia screamed. She literally screamed in horror, rushing around the table to drop to her knees beside her golden child. She wrapped her arms around Brittany, looking up at me with an expression of pure venomous hatred mixed with total despair. Her precious social standing was completely destroyed. The wealthy circles she had spent decades clawing her way into would slam their doors in her face the moment Chad's parents started talking. She was socially and financially dead. I shifted my gaze to my father. Thomas had not moved to help his wife or his favorite daughter. He was still sitting heavily in his leather chair, clutching his chest with one large, trembling hand. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his eyes staring blankly at the polished wood of the table. He was a man who had spent his entire life bullying the weak and dominating every room he entered. Now stripped of his lawyers, his fake wealth, and his intimidating presence, he looked exactly like what he truly was. A small, desperate, broken man facing the total collapse of his kingdom. I stood up slowly from my chair. I picked up my battered leather briefcase, the one they had mocked for years, and smoothed down the front of my professional blazer. I moved with a calm, deliberate grace that felt completely alien to the frightened girl who had lived under their roof. Robert and Agent Davis stood silently near the door, allowing me to take my final moment. They knew the legal destruction was their job, but the emotional closure belonged entirely to me. I walked around the massive mahogany table, stopping a few feet away from where my mother was kneeling on the floor. Patricia looked up at me, her face streaked with ruined makeup and tears of genuine anguish. "You told me I owed my sister happiness," I said, my voice cold, steady, and devoid of any remaining affection. "You told me I was born to support this family. You told me it was my duty to sacrifice my life so you could maintain your beautiful illusion." I paused, looking down at the three of them. But the truth is, I continued, my words dropping like stones into the quiet room. You owed me a family. You owed me parents who actually loved me. You chose your greed over your own daughter, and today you get to live with the exact consequences of that choice. Today I am taking my life completely back. I did not wait for an answer. There was absolutely nothing left for them to say. I turned my back on the weeping women and the broken man, and I walked purposefully toward the exit. I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the boardroom and out into the quiet, pristine hallway. I walked toward the elevators, my head held high, my spine perfectly straight. For the first time in 31 years, my chest did not feel tight with anxiety. The invisible, crushing weight of their expectations had been completely lifted from my shoulders. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside, turned around, and watched the polished steel doors slide shut, permanently closing the chapter on the family that had tried to destroy me. I was finally free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Has there ever been a time in your own life where you had to walk away from people who were supposed to protect you in order to save yourself? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this journey of justice and setting boundaries, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story. Let me know what city or country you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video. The Monday morning following the explosive boardroom meeting dawned with crisp, clear skies and an absolute symphony of financial carnage. I arrived at the accounting firm precisely at 8 o'clock carrying a fresh cup of coffee and a heart lighter than it had been in 3 decades. I sat at my meticulously organized desk watching the digital clock on my monitor tick forward. I knew exactly what was happening in the county clerk office miles away in the bustling city center. A junior legal assistant, unaware of the impending disaster, was standing at a heavy wooden counter, handing over a forged quitclaim deed. They expected a routine filing. Instead, they were met with a glaring red flag in the federal registry system. The property belonged to a legally protected, irrevocable trust. The rejection was instantaneous and absolute. Within 2 hours, the regional bank financing my father's desperate corporate bailout ran their final mandatory title trace. They saw the impenetrable Delaware trust. They saw the utter lack of viable collateral. The bank executives executed an immediate harsh withdrawal of their loan offer. By noon, Thomas construction firm, a sprawling house of cards, built on decades of bluffing, bullying, and financial smokescreens, officially flatlined. The collapse was incredibly swift and utterly merciless. Creditors who had been holding off, based on the promise of the bailout loan, began seizing his heavy machinery. Construction workers, realizing their paychecks would bounce, walked off active job sites, leaving half-built structures rotting in the afternoon sun. The Internal Revenue Service, notified of the sudden insolvency, moved swiftly to lock his remaining commercial accounts. The empire of dirt and intimidation my father had lorded over our family was completely wiped off the map before the end of the business day. But the financial ruin did not stop with my father. Brittany, who had spent her entire adult life banking heavily on her pretty face, and our parents' stolen money, was suddenly facing a brutal, devastating reality check. Chad had been completely serious when he stormed out of that conference room in disgust. The high society wedding of the season, the lavish event Patricia had bragged about to every wealthy woman in her social circle, was unceremoniously canceled. Invitations were aggressively revoked with humiliating whispered phone calls. However, the elite country club where Patricia had eagerly booked the grand reception did not care about broken engagements, shattered hearts, or scandalous family drama. They cared exclusively about their binding contract. Brittany and my mother were left holding the bag for a $30,000 non-refundable deposit. When the club manager demanded the remaining balance, my mother tried to write a check from an account the government had just frozen. The resulting insufficient funds notice was the final nail in the coffin of her pristine social standing. They had absolutely zero cash to pay their debts. You might reasonably think that hitting absolute rock bottom would teach a toxic family some basic humility, but toxic pride dies a very slow, incredibly ugly death. The most deeply satisfying twist of fate came from the very legal mercenaries they had hired to destroy me. The 4 elite litigation partners, now facing severe disciplinary action and potential disbarment for their documented role in federal extortion, were out for pure, unadulterated blood. They desperately needed a scapegoat to offer the state ethics board, and my parents were the perfect targets. The lawyers officially filed a massive, aggressive civil suit against Thomas and Patricia for unpaid legal fees, fraudulent misrepresentation, and flagrant breach of contract. My parents were completely defenseless. Without the company accounts, and with their personal savings entirely drained by Brittany wedding fiasco, they could not afford to hire new legal representation. The aggressive legal fees from the lawsuit piled up like a suffocating avalanche. Eventually, the regional bank moved in to foreclose on their pristine suburban home. This was the very house Patricia had worshipped as the ultimate symbol of her social superiority. It was the house where I had been ignored, sidelined, and treated like an unwanted guest. They were forcefully evicted by the county sheriff before the end of the autumn season. The sheer irony of their new living situation was almost poetic. Last I heard through the whispering grapevine of a distant cousin, Patricia and Thomas were living in a cramped 20-year-old recreational vehicle parked permanently on a cheap gravel lot near the state border. The arrogant woman who once mocked my modest apartment and sneered at my professional career was now sharing a tiny, poorly insulated metal box with the man who had completely bankrupted them. Patricia could no longer show her face at the local boutiques or the charity luncheons. The wealthy women she had spent decades flattering now actively crossed the street to avoid speaking to her. Brittany, meanwhile, was forced to take a minimum-wage retail job folding cheap sweaters at a mall outlet, taking the public bus every morning because the financing company had aggressively repossessed her leased luxury car. The grand, dazzling illusion of the perfect wealthy family was entirely dead-buried under the heavy weight of their own insatiable greed. While they were busy packing whatever meager belongings would fit into a rusty, damp camper, I was actively busy building my brilliant new future. Working strictly through Robert, my reliable Delaware trust attorney, I placed my grandmother waterfront property on the open competitive real estate market. Unburdened by my family constant emotional blackmail, the process was smooth and incredibly liberating. The house sold in less than a month to a lovely retired couple who appreciated the quiet beauty of the lake. The sale yielded a massive, life-changing sum of clean, legally protected capital. I used a portion of those funds to purchase a stunning, ultra-modern, high-rise condominium right in the beating heart of the city. Walking into it for the first time felt like stepping into an entirely new reality. Floor-to-ceiling windows gave me a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the glittering downtown skyline. The kitchen featured gleaming white quartz countertops and professional-grade appliances. It was sophisticated, secure, and most importantly, it was entirely exclusively mine. I changed my phone number. I upgraded my building security. No one from my past could ever walk through my front door and demand a single piece of my hard-earned peace. My professional life blossomed exponentially in the wonderful absence of constant familial anxiety. David, my strict managing partner, had watched the entire aggressive boardroom ambush unfold. He had seen the viciousness of my attackers and witnessed the absolute surgical precision with which I dismantled their entire plot. Instead of viewing me as a dramatic liability, he recognized a rare, unshakable nerve. He saw a woman who could remain perfectly composed while staring down the barrel of a loaded legal gun. When the annual corporate performance reviews came around, David called me directly into his spacious glass office. He did not just offer me a standard raise or a generic holiday bonus. He offered me a highly coveted, fast-tracked path to senior partnership. David looked at me from across his large desk, folding his hands together with deep professional respect. "Chloe, anyone who can seamlessly outmaneuver 4 predatory senior litigation partners without breaking a single sweat is exactly the kind of brilliant strategic financial mind I want helping to steer the future of this firm," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "You are fearless. You belong at the top." I accepted the promotion with a confident, grateful smile, knowing exactly how hard I had fought to earn my place in that room. Looking back on the smoldering wreckage and the glorious triumph of the past year, my perspective on life, love, and loyalty has fundamentally deeply shifted. I want to take a moment to speak directly to anyone listening to my voice right now who might be sitting exactly where I used to sit. We are systematically raised by society to believe that the word family is a sacred, unbreakable, magical bond. We are heavily conditioned from early childhood to accept that blood requires infinite, unquestioning sacrifice. We are repeatedly told to just keep the peace, to be the bigger person, to silently absorb the blatant disrespect, the targeted financial abuse, and the crushing emotional neglect because walking away is somehow falsely painted as the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. But I learned the incredibly hard way that the people who bleed you dry the most effectively often hide right behind that four-letter word. Toxic family members will expertly weaponize your natural empathy. They will gladly take your hard work, your precious savings, and your fragile sanity, and they will aggressively demand more while making you feel intensely guilty for what you have already freely given. They look at your independent stability not as a beautiful achievement to celebrate, but merely as a convenient resource to be selfishly harvested. I need you to hear this loud and clear. Setting firm, impenetrable boundaries is never an act of betrayal. It is not an act of selfish isolation or malicious cruelty. Setting boundaries is the absolute necessary protective armor you must wear to guard your own mental health and your inherent self-worth. You are not a walking automated teller machine. You are not a convenient stepping stone designed for someone else's fragile, inflated ego to walk all over. You are a vibrant, deserving human being who absolutely deserves to be valued for exactly who you are, not for what can be ruthlessly extracted from your personal bank account. When you finally gather the courage to stop pouring your vital energy into a bottomless, dark pit of familial greed, you will be absolutely amazed at the beautiful, highly successful life you can build for yourself. You do not owe anyone your bright future, especially not those individuals who actively, maliciously tried to destroy it for their own gain. It takes immense, profound courage to look directly at the people who gave you life and finally realize they are the very ones keeping you from truly living. It takes a terrifying, massive leap of faith to look a manipulative parent in the eye, to say the word no, and to mean it completely without a single ounce of hesitation. You will face guilt. You will face judgment from outsiders who simply do not understand the dark reality of your survival. But I promise you from the very bottom of my heart that on the other side of that suffocating fear is a freedom so incredibly sweet, so beautifully absolute, that you will only wonder why you waited so desperately long to reach out and claim it for yourself. If you have ever been pushed to the absolute edge by the very people who were supposed to fiercely protect you, did you stay silent? Or did you finally stand up and fight back? I want you to type the word freedom down in the comments below if you stand with me today. I read every single comment because I know exactly how isolating and terrifying this journey toward independence can feel, and I genuinely want to hear your stories of victory. Do not forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Your incredible support helps bring these vital stories of survival and empowerment to the people who desperately need to hear them the most. Always remember to fiercely protect your peace value, your own worth, and I will see you in the next story.